The night was a curtain of storm and silence stretching over the black Atlantic, broken only by the hum of engines and the white flash of lightning. Far below, the convoy crept through the waves, 30 merchant ships flanked by their escorts, their decks slick with salt and rain. Each vessel ran dark, no running lights, no signals, only the rhythm of engines pounding against the gale. Above them, unseen shapes crossed the clouds, Luftwaffe bombers of Kampfgeschwader, hunting by instinct and dead reckoning. They had struck here before, swooping down like ghosts upon the lumbering convoys, confident the night was their shield. Tonight they came again, guided by arrogance and the belief that Britain could not see what the sky itself could not. Inside one Heinkel He 111, the pilot licked the salt from his lips, his oxygen mask damp with condensation. His bombardier leaned forward, peering into the void through his sight, waiting for a glimmer of steel on the sea. The radio crackled with a clipped German voice. Convoy sighted, course north-northwest. The storm swallowed the words almost as soon as they were spoken, and from the depths of the black horizon the unseen replied. In a coastal bunker 500 miles away, the women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force leaned over a glowing cathode screen. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and concentration, the silence broken only by the steady pulse of the radar's sweep. Each rotation painted the map with faint green ghosts, echoes of metal wings cutting through rain. One operator straightened, eyes narrowing, multiple returns, bearing 095, altitude low. The controller behind her raised a hand, his voice calm but urgent. Coastal Command, this is Plot Room North. We have movement inbound to convoy HX 229. Within seconds, telephones rang across the operations room like alarm bells. In an instant, coordinates turned into orders, and orders turned into flight paths. Somewhere on a wind-battered airfield in Scotland, mechanics ran for the Beaufighters, engines roaring to life in the dark. The storm that had hidden the enemy would now hide the hunters. Inside the German formation, the storm felt like a living thing. The rain struck the fuselage with the sound of grinding glass, and the horizon had vanished entirely into black vapor. The lead navigator adjusted his map light, tracing the faint outline of their course toward the convoy's last known position. "It should be here," he muttered, voice muffled under his headset. Below them, lightning revealed the ocean for a split second, a writhing, furious plain of white-capped waves and darkness. The bomb aimer pressed his face to the sight, waiting for the convoy's shadow to emerge. When the next flash came, he saw nothing. The British had doused every flame, hidden every trace. Confusion rippled through the formation as instruments wavered under magnetic interference. Somewhere behind them, one aircraft broke formation, banking hard into the dark. The commander hesitated, and then the radar operators at the Allied base marked their moment. From 10,000 feet above the Irish Sea, 2 Bristol Beaufighters raced through the clouds, guided by invisible precision. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's world was confined to green dials and the steady murmur of the radar operator seated behind him. "Target bearing 240, closing fast," came the voice through the intercom. Cool, mechanical, unflinching. The aircraft shuddered as it cut through turbulence, rain hammering against the canopy. The pilot wiped condensation from the glass, scanning the void ahead. Then faintly, through the lightning movement, the outline of a bomber, flying low and steady, unaware it was being stalked. "Visual contact," the pilot whispered, throttling forward. The Beaufighter's cannons armed with a low metallic click, a sound almost drowned by the storm. In the next instant, the night erupted in fire. The bomber disintegrated mid-air, scattering into the ocean like falling stars. Above the radio static, one phrase cut through: confirmed kill. On the sea below, men aboard the convoy ship saw flashes light up the horizon. They mistook it at first for lightning, until the sound reached them, a deep rolling thunder that did not belong to nature. Sailors looked up to see faint orange blooms rippling across the clouds, like battles being fought inside the sky. Some cheered, some simply stared, too exhausted to comprehend. The escorts kept their course steady, the radar masts humming faintly as they tracked both friend and foe. Inside the bridge of HMS Ayrshire, the captain leaned over his display, eyes fixed on the signals pulsing back from the aerial array. "They're defending us," his first officer murmured. The captain didn't answer. He simply nodded once and returned his gaze to the sea. In that moment, the convoy's survival depended not on the ships but on invisible waves in the air. The night, once their executioner, had become their ally. In another Heinkel bomber, Lieutenant Karl Broer wrestled with his controls as tracer fire streaked past his wing. His gunner shouted above the roar of the engines, firing blind into the storm. "Where are they?" Broer demanded, voice cracking. The sky offered no answer, only flashes of light and the scream of bullets slicing through air. His instruments flickered, his compass spun, and his radar warning receiver stayed blank. They had been ambushed by something they couldn't detect, couldn't predict, couldn't fight. A shell tore through the fuselage, ripping open the rear compartment in a burst of flame. Broer's co-pilot was thrown forward, blood splattering the dashboard. The Heinkel began to roll, spiraling into darkness. Broer pulled hard on the stick, but the night swallowed him whole. His last thought as the altimeter spun towards zero was disbelief. The enemy could see in the dark. At RAF Castle Archdale, the operations room buzzed with calm efficiency. Radar stations along the coast fed a continuous stream of data into the plotting tables. Markers moved like chess pieces across the North Atlantic map. Every blip had a story: a bomber evading pursuit, an interceptor climbing to engage, a convoy adjusting course. The air smelled of ink, ozone and fear. Officers leaned over the tables, tracing lines with pencils worn down to stubs. A single decision here meant hundreds of lives saved or lost out there. Through a loudspeaker, a voice read the latest report. 3 confirmed intercepts, 2 probable. Convoy HX 229 remains intact. Applause didn't follow. Only the quiet satisfaction of professionals doing what had once seemed impossible. The technology worked. The night had been illuminated by logic. The surviving Luftwaffe bombers limped back toward occupied France, their fuel low, their crews shaken. Inside one aircraft, silence replaced confidence. The radio operator stared at his flickering instruments, whispering under his breath, "How did they find us?" The pilot didn't answer. His gloved hands trembled slightly on the yoke, the storm finally easing to drizzle. Below them, faint glimmers of the Channel coast appeared through the clouds. Safety, but at a price. In the debriefing halls at Bordeaux-Merignac, their commanders would listen in disbelief to tales of British aircraft appearing out of nowhere. "It was as if they knew where we were before we did," one airman said, his voice hollow. The officers wrote it off as nerves, fatigue, bad weather. But deep down, something far more unsettling had taken root. The Germans had lost the one advantage they thought was theirs: the night. In the days that followed, reports poured into Berlin from radar posts, submarines, and air crews. The British had developed a new detection system, something beyond the known frequencies, something that pierced cloud, rain, and darkness. Analysts in the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium pored over the fragments, trying to decode the mystery. Impossible, one declared. If they can see in the dark, we will lose the sea. Meanwhile in London, engineers at Bawdsey Manor quietly celebrated another successful night. No headlines, no speeches, only the steady hum of generators and the quiet satisfaction of science turned to survival. They had proven that information could be a weapon as potent as fire. In the Atlantic, the balance had shifted without a single fleet engagement. The invisible war had begun, and for the first time the hunters understood they were being hunted. The storm cleared by dawn, leaving the Atlantic pale and glassy beneath the first light. Wreckage drifted between the waves, twisted aluminum oil slicks, the ghostly remains of arrogance. Above it all, the radar antennas aboard British escorts turned lazily, scanning the empty sky. In the calm that followed, the men aboard the convoy ships exhaled for the first time in hours. The sea was quiet again, but they knew the silence was not peace, only pause. In their logbooks they recorded the night without detail, only gratitude. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's morning report spoke of unexpected resistance and unexplained enemy interception. The truth was simpler. The age of invisibility was over. Technology had given Britain a shield of sight, and the darkness that once offered safety had turned into a trap. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. It began, as so many revolutions do, with a question and a flicker on a screen. In a cold laboratory outside Slough in early 1935, the air smelled of ozone and damp insulation. Robert Watson Watt stood over a humming transmitter, the cables snaking across the floor like veins carrying invisible power. Outside, a Hawker biplane cut through the grey February sky, its engine droning low over the fields. Inside, the oscilloscope's green line trembled, once, twice, then danced in rhythm with the aircraft's passing. Watson Watt leaned forward, eyes narrowed behind thick lenses, as the signal returned again. The room fell silent except for the hum of electricity and the faint tapping of rain against the window pane. "Gentlemen," he murmured, turning to his assistant. "There it is, proof." What he had detected was not light or sound, but the reflection of radio waves bouncing off metal. A new sense had just been born, one that could see beyond the limits of human sight. In that moment, Britain gained the ability to look into the invisible. The Ministry of Air was skeptical at first, as bureaucracies always are with miracles. Watson Watt's reports, filled with diagrams and frequency charts, seemed too abstract for men trained in the tangible. Yet, by March 1935, curiosity overcame disbelief. On a barren strip of coast at Orford Ness, the Air Ministry arranged a full demonstration. 4 massive wooden masts rose against the horizon, their wires humming in the coastal wind. Across the marshland, technicians huddled around receivers, their breath fogging the chilled air. As aircraft flew overhead, the screen flared with electric life. "Target detected. Range 12 miles," came the voice through the radio, calm but triumphant. The observers exchanged wary glances, realizing that something profound had occurred. The sky itself could now speak. A system was being born that would one day rewrite the fate of nations, and its first cry was the sound of static. The government called it RDF, Radio Direction Finding, a name chosen deliberately to disguise its potential. The work continued under strict secrecy, hidden behind coded memos and anonymous requisition orders. Engineers and physicists from all over Britain were recruited quietly, their skills redirected from universities and laboratories into defense. They worked in sheds and fields, testing antenna arrays against seagulls, static, and the endless sea wind. The towers grew taller each month, skeletons of steel and wood lining the coastline like sentinels rising from the mist. Villagers watched in confusion as these strange structures appeared along the cliffs, guarded by soldiers who said nothing. At night, the towers pulsed with faint radio waves, invisible ripples reaching into the sky. Every echo returned a whisper of the world above, a flock of birds, a passing storm, the wings of a single aircraft. Slowly the network took form, stretching from the Isle of Wight to the Scottish Highlands, and in the silence between transmissions the defenders of Britain were learning to hear what could not be seen. Watson Watt was not a military man, but his genius was rooted in urgency. He understood that the speed of innovation had to outpace the speed of destruction. Across the Channel, the shadow of the Luftwaffe was lengthening. German airfields expanding, bomber production accelerating. Intelligence reports spoke of squadrons training for long-range strikes and precision raids. Britain's island defences, though proud, were still built for an older kind of war. The Royal Air Force could not fight what it could not find. In meetings with Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, Watson Watt argued that radar would give warning before attack, minutes that could mean survival. Dowding, cautious but visionary, agreed. The two men formed an alliance of necessity, science and strategy entwined, and in their shared belief, the blueprint for modern air defense began to take shape. By 1938, the first operational radar chain home, stood completed along the eastern coast. Each station bristled with towering steel masts, sending and receiving beams of energy into the heavens. Operators trained to read the faint green traces on their cathode ray screens, learning to distinguish aircraft from weather. Every echo carried meaning. Every anomaly demanded interpretation. The rooms smelled of hot dust, ozone, and the faint tang of metal, as if charged with invisible electricity. Behind the technical precision lay quiet human courage, the patience to listen to silence and extract pattern from chaos. In the control rooms, young women with headsets recorded bearings in calm, clipped voices. Track 1 bearing northeast, speed 200 miles per hour. The words traveled instantly by telephone to Fighter Command headquarters, where plots appeared on large translucent maps. The unseen network connected coast to command, pulse to response. The island had grown invisible nerves, and they would soon be tested. At first, many in the RAF distrusted this new technology. Veteran pilots scoffed at the idea that machines could replace eyesight or intuition. "You can't fight a war with oscilloscopes," one group captain remarked dryly, but time and demonstration proved otherwise. During night exercises in 1939, radar stations detected incoming aircraft long before any observer spotted them. Interceptors scrambled precisely to altitude, meeting targets in the dark sky above the North Sea. Pilots returned, shaken but impressed. "They knew where we'd be," one remarked in disbelief. The skepticism gave way to silent awe. It was as though the nation had been granted a sixth sense, tuned not to vision but to vibration. Radar had bridged the gap between science fiction and survival. In Berlin, the news of Britain's mysterious detection capability reached intelligence circles through scattered reports. German engineers speculated on new sound locators or optical devices, dismissing the notion of radio detection as fantasy. Hermann Goering laughed when one aide mentioned it during a briefing. "You think they can see through the clouds?" He scoffed. Yet, deep in Peenemünde, a few cautious minds began to wonder, if the British had truly mastered invisible sight, the entire balance of air warfare could shift. They underestimated how far the science had already come. Every hour, new stations went live. Every week, new technicians joined the network. By the eve of war, the entire coastline glowed with silent sentinels, and while Germany sharpened its blades, Britain quietly built its shield. When the first air raid alarms wailed over London in 1939, radar was already watching. Chain home stations tracked the incoming formations as they lifted from occupied Europe, their flight paths plotted in real time on Dowding's vast operations board. For the first time in human history, an entire nation saw its own defense unfold as moving light on a wall. Controllers issued scramble orders with uncanny precision, vectoring hurricanes and Spitfires directly into the path of the attackers. Every successful interception proved that the invisible had become indispensable. The operators, often overlooked, worked through exhaustion, their hands steady on dials that pulsed with danger. Outside, the bombers roared overhead, but their element of surprise was gone. The unseen defenders had already spoken. Radar had turned intelligence into instinct, data into defense, and the night itself had switched allegiance. In those early months, radar was as fragile as it was powerful. Circuits burned out under heavy use, and the cathode tubes glowed dim from overexposure. But for every failure, a dozen repairs were made before dawn. The technicians became artisans of the invisible, coaxing signals from interference, balancing frequency against fate. They worked in wind-lashed towers surrounded by humming transformers and the endless song of static. When storms cut power, they ran generators by hand. When the Luftwaffe bombed the stations, they rebuilt them within hours. Each pulse from the transmitters was a heartbeat of the nation's defense, and through the hum of machinery, the voice of invention whispered, "We can see you now." By 1940, radar had evolved from experiment to empire, an empire of electrons and echoes, built in secrecy, but powered by brilliance. It had begun with one man in a laboratory, chasing a flicker of green across a screen. Now it stretched across an entire coast, defending millions who would never know its name. The system was primitive by modern measure, cumbersome, temperamental, alive only through human skill. Yet its impact would define the next decade of warfare, shaping strategy from the Battle of Britain to the North Atlantic. For every life saved, there was a signal. For every raid intercepted, a trace of static. Out of invisible waves came tangible survival. The miracle of radar was not in its machinery, but in its meaning, vision where none should exist. And from that faint hum on a winter's night in 1935 came the power that changed the course of the war. From static on a screen came the signal that would save a nation. In the summer of 1940, while the Blitz rained down upon Britain, another war unfolded unseen, a war of frequencies, equations, and invisible duels. Inside a nondescript hangar in occupied France, Luftwaffe technicians crouched over radio equipment glowing faintly in the dark. The air hummed with static, and the faint hiss of vacuum tubes warming to life. Across the map on the wall, thin pencil lines stretched toward England, invisible corridors of radio waves called knickebeen, or crooked leg. The idea was revolutionary and sinisterly precise. Guide bombers to their targets using intersecting beams of radio energy. If a pilot stayed between the tones, he would reach his destination, even in total darkness. To the Germans, it was the ultimate advantage. Science turned into accuracy. Technology turned into terror. The operators adjusted their dials, matching frequencies transmitted from powerful ground stations in France and Germany. In Berlin, they called it blind bombing. In London, they soon called it something else entirely, the Battle of the Beams. At first, it seemed unstoppable. German bombers flying through dense clouds struck factories, shipyards, and cities with alarming precision. British intelligence was baffled. "How do they find us in the dark?" asked one RAF officer, after yet another night of surgical devastation. It wasn't luck, it was engineering. Signals from transmitters at Clave and Stolberg guiding bombers along narrow corridors of radio sound. Each signal, modulated in phase, told the pilot whether to turn left or right. When two beams intersected, the bomb bay doors opened. The Luftwaffe had transformed mathematics into murder. Even when clouds hid the moon and rain blurred the coast, the bombs still fell exactly where intended. It was as if the enemy had drawn a line across the sky and followed it unerringly. Britain for the first time realized that the air war had entered a new dimension. But science, once unleashed, invites counter-science. In a quiet office in Dorset, a physicist named Reginald Victor Jones read intercepted Luftwaffe manuals and scratched notes across the margins. A student of logic and patience, he suspected that the Germans were using radio beams, and that those beams could be found, measured, and broken. Working with the telecommunications research establishment, Jones began plotting suspected transmitter sites on a map of Europe. If they can aim by sound, he told his team, we can deceive their ears. Portable receivers were rushed to the coast, their antennas pointing into the night sky. And then one evening they caught it, a faint hum repeating in rhythm. Somewhere beyond the channel, Germany was whispering to its bombers. Jones smiled. The whispers would soon be turned against them. The first counterattack came not from aircraft, but from mathematics. British engineers calculated the frequencies of the Nikibane beams and built transmitters tuned to the same wavelength. These masking stations emitted false signals, bending the German beams just enough to mislead. The process was delicate. Too much interference, and the deception would be obvious. Too little, and the bombs would still find their mark. Night by night, operators experimented with timing and amplitude. In control rooms along the coast, young technicians leaned over their dials, sweat dripping down their necks as they adjusted frequencies by fractions of a megahertz. Slowly, the results appeared. Bomb craters began appearing in empty fields, marshlands, and once a cow pasture outside Bristol. The Luftwaffe was confused. Their precision had vanished into chaos, and the British had struck their first silent blow in the new war of waves. Frustrated but undeterred, the Germans escalated. They introduced the X-Garret, a more advanced beam system that used multiple intersecting signals to refine accuracy down to meters. It was the engineer's revenge, a device that transformed night bombing into geometry. But Britain's scientists had been listening all along. Jones's team captured fragments of enemy communication, decoding references to Wotan, the all-seeing god of Germanic myth, and realized the irony: the single eye could be blinded. Using hastily constructed jammers hidden along the coast, they emitted decoy signals to distort the X-Garret guidance. On the night of November 6, 1940, the system was tested in combat. German bombers aimed for Coventry's industrial heart and missed, scattering bombs across the countryside. To the Luftwaffe, it was an inexplicable failure. To the British, it was confirmation. They had learned to fight with lightless weapons. The duel deepened. The Germans responded with Y-Garret, the most complex system yet, combining timing, range-finding, and coded synchronization. Each signal pulse returned information on distance and bearing, allowing controllers in occupied Europe to guide individual aircraft remotely. It was precision bombing guided by invisible lines of command. Once again, Jones and his team intercepted the clues. "They think we can't hear them," he said quietly, studying the patterns. Using direction-finding antennas, they triangulated the Y-Garret frequencies, building new jammers to create ghost echoes, phantom reflections that fed false data back to German controllers. In Berlin, technicians watched their scopes in disbelief as aircraft appeared to drift miles off course. Confusion turned to panic, and amid the static, Britain's counterattack was writing itself in invisible ink. Inside Luftwaffe command centers, the frustration was palpable. Reports from returning crews spoke of beacons gone silent, false tones overlapping true ones, and targets that vanished into the night. "The English must have spies in our system," one officer insisted, but there were no spies, only scientists. The same intellectual rigor that had built Germany's beams was now mirrored across the Channel, twisted into resistance. For the first time, Goering's staff began to realize that they were fighting not merely pilots but minds. The bombers still came, but their accuracy decayed with every night. Bombs fell harmlessly into fields, rivers, and empty suburbs. Each error was invisible proof that the British countermeasures were working, and each failure was a note in the slow symphony of German defeat. In London, Jones's office grew into a nerve centre for electronic warfare. His chalkboards filled with waveforms and coordinates, the air dense with pipe smoke and quiet triumph. Visitors from Fighter Command often found him pacing barefoot, muttering through equations. "We must think like their engineers," he said once, "and then outthink them." The team's work was part science, part art, a ballet of precision and deception performed across the electromagnetic spectrum. Each discovery fed into new defensive strategies: radar jamming, false returns, counter-interference. What had begun as a desperate reaction became a proactive system. Britain's first organized electronic defense. Out of necessity, the world's first cyber war had begun, waged in frequencies rather than fire, and every heartbeat of it echoed through the static that filled the air above the Channel. By 1941, the Battle of the Beams had shifted decisively. German aircrews no longer trusted their instruments. Reports described ghost corridors, false beams, and voices where no transmitters existed. Pilots switched to visual navigation, abandoning their precision guidance altogether. The technological edge had reversed. Britain, once blind and outmatched, had learned to weaponize invisibility. The airwaves that once guided death now carried deception. Every broadcast, every pulse became both a shield and a sword. In a war fought under cover of darkness, it was knowledge that burned brightest, and for the first time the Luftwaffe began to fear the silence between their own signals. The Battle of the Beams was never officially declared, yet its outcome changed the course of the war. From static and mathematics, Britain had forged an invisible defense more potent than armor. The air raids continued, but the terror of unstoppable precision was gone. The bombers still came, but their confidence evaporated, replaced by doubt that grew with every false echo. For the scientists it was vindication, proof that intellect could shield a nation as surely as steel. The battlefields of the future would no longer be bound by geography, but by wavelength. From that point onward, every signal would carry the shadow of that duel, and as dawn broke over the Channel, both sides realized that the war of machines had entered a new era. It was not bullets but frequencies that decided the first battles of the electronic war. The Atlantic in 1941 was a graveyard of steel. Convoys stretched across the vast grey horizon, their wakes trailing like scars through the water. Beneath them, unseen, German U-boats hunted in silence, predators of the deep, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Each night, torpedoes found their marks, ships burned on the black horizon, and survivors clung to debris as the cold consumed them. Britain's lifeline to the New World was bleeding. The Admiralty knew that if the Atlantic fell, the war would follow. Yet, somewhere in the laboratories of the Royal Air Force, a new kind of hope flickered. Engineers were adapting the land-based radar, once Britain's eyes in the sky, for use over the open sea. It was called Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar, or ASV, and though crude and temperamental, it would soon transform the ocean into a battlefield of light and shadow. The first tests were humble but electric with possibility. At RAF St. Aulthan, technicians bolted radar sets to the bellies of aging aircraft. Whitleys, Hudsons and Wellingtons that groaned under the added weight. The new equipment was unpredictable, its signals dancing wildly on cathode ray screens as waves reflected radio pulses back like ghosts. But sometimes, amid the clutter, a shape would appear, solid, distinct, unmistakable. A submarine's periscope breaking the surface, a conning tower slicing through foam. The operators cheered quietly in the darkened cabins, watching the faint green blip move across the screen. "That's him," one whispered, almost reverently. The first detection, the first proof that radar could reach beyond the coast. The sea, once a void of mystery, had just spoken. The invisible enemy could now be found by invisible means. The first operational patrols of Coastal Command began in the winter of 1941. The conditions were brutal. Salt spray freezing against windshields, engines coughing in the Arctic wind. But in the cramped compartments of radar-equipped aircraft, hope replaced exhaustion. The crews learned to read the patterns, the flicker of a wave crest, the steady pulse of steel beneath the waterline. The moment a contact appeared, the tension in the cabin shifted from fatigue to focus. Pilots banked low, straining their eyes for the faintest shadow on the waves. Then came the attack, flares dropping, depth charges rolling into the deep. Seconds later, explosions turned the sea white with fury. When the spray settled, nothing remained but oil and debris. For the first time, the hunters of the deep had become the hunted. Meanwhile at sea, radar found a new home aboard the small, stubborn ships that guarded the convoys. The corvettes and destroyer escorts, once blind in fog and darkness, now carried the glow of cathode tubes in their wheelhouses. The air smelled of ozone, grease, and sea salt as the operators turned their dials, scanning for faint echoes among the waves. "Contact. Range 2,000 yards, bearing 080, came the voice from the set. The captain ordered engines to half speed, his breath fogging the glass of the bridge. Every man aboard knew what that meant. Something lurked ahead, something unseen. The radar display pulsed again, the target moving. Depth charges were armed, and sailors braced against the rail. The Atlantic, once ruled by silence, was now an orchestra of echoes, and every note meant survival. In the mess decks below, the crews learned to trust the technology that had once seemed like sorcery. They watched as their officers plotted radar contacts on damp charts, each pencil mark a life-or-death decision. The young operators, many barely 20, spoke of their screens as if they were living things. "You can feel it when it's a U-boat," one said. "The trace is steadier. It moves with purpose." They spent hours hunched in the glow, headphones crackling with the hum of the generator. When fatigue took them, they dreamed of green lines and phantom blips drifting across their vision. Above deck, rain lashed the antennas, lightning flashing against the mast. But inside, the radar hummed on, undaunted by storm or night. It was the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare, the war of detection. The U-boat commanders, once masters of the ocean, began to feel the pressure. Reports filtered back to Admiral Donitz's headquarters. Submarines sighted in darkness, attacked before they could dive. "They find us even when we are hidden," one captain wrote bitterly. The crews grew uneasy, scanning the sky as much as the sea. The very waves seemed to betray them now. What they could not see was that their metal hulls, once cloaked by distance and weather, now betrayed their presence through the echoes of radar beams. The Allies had turned physics itself into a weapon. Every returning pulse told a story: range, bearing, existence. The U-boat's invisibility, its greatest strength, was fading. The hunters had learned to listen to the silence and find what lurked within it. By 1942, radar had become the lifeline of the Atlantic convoys. Coastal Command aircraft flew with renewed purpose, patrolling the shipping lanes that fed Britain's survival. Each radar contact meant another chance to strike before the U-boats could organize their deadly wolf packs. Pilots developed tactics to exploit the advantage, cutting engines, diving silently out of cloud cover, attacking before the enemy could submerge. In the glow of their instruments, they became part of a larger machine, the fusion of man, metal, and magnetron. The radar's hum became as familiar as a heartbeat, its flicker as trusted as sight. Across the North Atlantic, the balance had shifted subtly but decisively. The U-boats still struck, but they struck blindly. The Allies, for the first time, were not reacting, they were anticipating, and the ocean, long an accomplice of the hunter, was now on the side of the hunted. The technology evolved quickly, as necessity demanded. The early ASV Mark I gave way to Mark II, then Mark III, each more compact, more powerful, more precise. The magnetron, a small copper device forged in secret laboratories, multiplied radar's reach tenfold. Suddenly, radar was no longer confined to large aircraft or coastal towers. It could be fitted to patrol planes, escort carriers, even small vessels that once relied on luck. With every improvement, the invisible shield grew thicker. The men who operated it spoke of their instruments with quiet reverence, aware they were part of something larger than themselves. Radar had become not just a tool but a companion, a steady, unblinking ally in the endless dark. And for every ship that reached port, its quiet pulse was part of the reason why. In Berlin, the realization came slowly, then all at once. Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine analysts reported increasing losses, unexplained detections and attacks from unseen aircraft. "It must be magic," one admiral said in frustration. It was not magic, it was mathematics. German scientists raced to develop radar detectors, crude devices to warn of Allied transmissions. They called them METOCs, and for a time they offered hope. But soon the British adapted again, changing frequencies, shifting wavelengths, rendering the detectors useless. The U-boat captains returned to sea blind once more, and in their logs one phrase appeared again and again: "We are being hunted by ghosts." The ghosts were real, but they glowed in green instead of white. By the spring of 1943, radar had become the silent guardian of the Atlantic. Every escort ship, every reconnaissance plane, every convoy carried within it the eyes of the unseen. The once invincible U-boat arm was now forced into retreat, its kills fewer, its losses mounting. The ocean that had once sheltered predators now betrayed them with every reflected wave. Radar had turned the tide not through destruction but through revelation. What was once mystery had become measurement. What was once terror had become comprehension. In the quiet between storms, sailors stood on deck and watched the antenna sweep the horizon, its rhythmic rotation as comforting as a lighthouse beam. The ocean was no longer an abyss. It was a map of echoes, a living network of sound and signal. For the first time, the Atlantic had a voice. For the first time, the ocean itself began to speak. By 1942, the British Empire stretched across the world like a living nervous system, and radar had become its pulse. From frozen cliffs in Iceland to sun-baked runways in Malta, the hum of transmitters and the flicker of cathode tubes bound distant outposts into one defensive whole. In darkened bunkers and seaside shacks, operators stared into glowing screens, watching the invisible arc sweep the sky. Each rotation carried news of life or death, the approach of a bomber, the shadow of a convoy, the echo of something vast and unknown. For the first time, empire was not just territory, it was information. A signal born in one corner of the world could save lives in another. On the map tables at Whitehall, bright threads of radio coverage arced across oceans and continents. Dots became stations, stations became networks, and networks became a shield. It was not uniform nor flawless, but it was vast. The empire that once relied on ships and cables was now bound by airwaves, and those invisible lines would prove stronger than steel. Gibraltar was one of the first to receive the new technology, the gateway to the Mediterranean, the rock that saw everything but slept for no one. On its summit, radar masts jutted into the salt wind, their beams cutting across the narrow strait toward North Africa. Below, convoys steamed eastward, watched over by operators sealed inside concrete bunkers that smelled of dust, sweat, and oil. Their screens flickered with the silhouettes of aircraft crossing from Vichy-controlled Morocco. Their bearings fed instantly to gun batteries and fighter squadrons. Contact, 20 miles north-northeast, came the call, crisp as the crack of a rifle. The gunners outside adjusted their aim, trusting voices they never saw. When enemy planes came, Gibraltar's guns spoke before the pilots even knew they'd been spotted. The rock had grown new eyes, carved not from granite, but from current. At dawn, the operators emerged to the golden glare of the sea, their faces pale from the glow of their screens. They had guarded an empire while the world slept. Farther east, Malta was enduring one of the longest sieges in modern history. Bombed daily, starved of fuel, and surrounded by Axis airfields. Yet it refused to fall. Beneath its honey-colored stone fortresses, radar operators listened for the faintest trace of incoming raiders. They called their station Pip, after the pulse that jumped across the cathode screen whenever an aircraft broke the horizon. Each pulse meant the difference between readiness and ruin. In the pitch-dark rooms beneath Valletta's bastions, the sound of typewriters and telephones blended with the mechanical hum of radar transmitters. Bandits approaching, Angels 15, bearing 280, one operator would announce, her voice level despite exhaustion. Above ground, Spitfires scrambled before the enemy had crossed the sea. To German pilots it seemed as though the British always knew. In truth, they did. The island's survival depended on those echoes, on the courage of those who watched without ever being seen. In the icy north, the story was different, but no less vital. On the volcanic cliffs of Iceland, British and American crews braved freezing winds to man radar outposts that protected Arctic convoys bound for Murmansk. The equipment groaned under frost, the antennae creaking as ice formed along their arms. Operators wore gloves so thick they could barely adjust their dials, yet they stayed at their posts, hour after hour, eyes locked to the faint green traces moving across the screen. Each contact could mean salvation for a convoy trapped in fog or death from a Luftwaffe attack emerging from Norway's coast. The Arctic air carried static that made the signals dance like ghosts. Still, the men listened, adjusting frequencies, reading between the noise. "We heard the world's cold breath," one operator later said, and within it the sound of danger. For every ship that reached Archangel, a radar beam had quietly guided its way through the storm. The North had learned to whisper, and Britain listened. To the west, Newfoundland stood as the Empire's transatlantic watchtower. The radar stations built along its cliffs looked out toward a vast, dangerous horizon, the same sea lanes where U-boats lurked beneath the waves. The wind carried the smell of pine and diesel fuel as radar dishes rotated slowly, scanning the grey Atlantic. In St. John's Serve, British and Canadian crews shared cramped quarters, their radios tuned to the hum of the ocean itself. Echo at bearing 110 came the report, sometimes followed by silence, sometimes by the alarm that sent escort aircraft roaring into the sky. When the signal was right, the coordination between radar, aircraft and ships was seamless, a symphony of technology and timing. Newfoundland became the bridge between continents, its transmitters the first to catch the enemy emerging from the fog. The men stationed there rarely saw combat directly, yet their vigilance saved thousands. The North Atlantic's heartbeat passed through their hands. In the great machine of empire, they were its pulse. The Royal Navy, too, embraced the new vision. Its capital ships and destroyers, once reliant on spotlights and lookouts, now carried radar systems bristling from their masts. The officers on deck learned to trust invisible readings over human instinct. If the screen says they're there, one captain declared after his radar detected an enemy cruiser hours before it was visible. The new technology transformed night engagements into deadly precision duels. In the Battle of Cape Matapan, British ships used radar to track and destroy Italian vessels in darkness so complete the enemy never saw them coming. The sea had become an extension of the radar's eye, vast, reflective, alive. Radar officers became the unseen navigators of victory, their calm voices guiding fire control systems and fleet maneuvers. Where once there was guesswork, now there was certainty. The Empire's fleets no longer sailed blind through black water. They carried within them the light of invisible stars. The radar network reached beyond Europe, stretching across the Empire's furthest edges. In Ceylon, stations were hastily constructed from bamboo and salvaged steel to guard against Japanese raids. In Egypt, radar outposts watched the desert skies for signs of the Luftwaffe's North African arm. In Kenya, Rhodesia, and Singapore, colonial engineers worked beside British officers, their fingers tracing cables that linked continents. "It hums," one local technician said, smiling as the screen came alive for the first time. The hum meant inclusion, the sound of connection, of empire not as domination but as cooperation. Through radar, communication replaced isolation, from tropical heat to Arctic ice. A single system bound together people who might never meet but fought for the same horizon. For the first time, the Empire's scattered outposts were not divided by distance. They were united by signal, and through those signals the Empire became aware of itself. At the heart of this growing network stood the command centers: London, Gibraltar, Alexandria, and later Colombo. Inside, giant wall maps lit with colored bulbs marked the world's war zones like constellations. Every beam of radar, every transmission, every blip on the screen flowed into these rooms. Telephones buzzed, pencils scratched, and voices recited, bearing and altitude in an endless rhythm of precision. From these nerve centers, the Admiralty coordinated convoys, air patrols, and fleet movements with an accuracy that would have been impossible just years earlier. Radar had made the world visible, and visibility had made control possible. The men and women working behind those glowing panels rarely saw battle themselves, but their calculations determined who lived and who did not. They were, as one admiral described, the unseen captains of the Empire's ships, and their command stretched not across land or sea, but through the ether itself. The Axis powers, watching from afar, never fully grasped the scale of this invisible architecture. They saw isolated victories, local defeats, but not the threads that link them. German intelligence underestimated how far the radar network extended, believing it confined to the British Isles. They did not see the pattern, the global lattice that turned every horizon into a warning system. When U-boats slipped through the Strait of Gibraltar, radar caught them in mid-passage. When bombers crossed the Mediterranean, Malta's operators traced their paths like hunters following footprints. When weather fronts rose in the North Atlantic, Newfoundland warned convoys days in advance. The Empire had achieved what centuries of communication had only dreamed: instant awareness across the world. The British were no longer reacting to the war, they were predicting it, and that foresight was worth more than any weapon. By 1943, the Empire's radar network formed a single breathing organism. It watched, listened, and coordinated across hemispheres, a collaboration of scientists, sailors, and citizens bound by unseen lines, from the Rock of Gibraltar to the cliffs of Iceland, from the coral stations of Ceylon to the fog-drenched coasts of Canada. It functioned as one. The British Empire had transcended geography. It had become a living web of energy and awareness. Every pulse from every tower was a heartbeat, every reflection a thought, every signal a whisper of vigilance. Through this invisible architecture, the Empire rediscovered its unity, not through conquest, but through connection. The war had forced innovation, but innovation had created communion. And long after the echoes of gunfire faded, the hum of radar would remain, the sound of a world newly linked. The British Empire had become a web of waves, unseen but unbroken. In the summer before radar reshaped the heavens, the Luftwaffe moved with a swagger born of success and swift engineering. Their bombers, Hinkel 111S, with blunt noses, Junkers Ju 88S, with lean aggression, and the long-winged Focke-Wulf Volv 200 Condors that could stalk convoys from the horizon, stitched the skies with menace. Cockpits smelled of oil, warm leather, and the faint tang of grease, while the engine note beneath the fuselage felt like an answering heartbeat. Crews trained in formation, flying until movement became muscle memory and night flew like day. In mess halls, pilots swapped claims like currency, each story inflating prestige within squadrons and widening the gulf between fear and fact. They practiced low-level attacks to evade radar they believed primitive and trusted their instruments for dead reckoning over oceans where compasses and stars could be treacherous. The Kriegsmarine welcomed these eyes in the sky. The U-boats relied on them to spot convoys against the infinite sea. Confidence became doctrine. Pride hardened into arrogance, and across the channel German airmen began to believe darkness itself was a blanket they controlled. They thought the night belonged to them. The F-Dewey 200, dubbed the Scourge of the Atlantic, turned merchant convoys into hunting maps for the Luftwaffe. It could fly long hours over the waves, its engines singing at high altitude while radio operators plotted positions on charts smudged with salt. From its blister windows came the first warnings, a light on the horizon, smoke rising from a damaged freighter, the tiny wake of a lone destroyer. When the F-Dewey 200 radioed coordinates, the wolves below rose to meet the feast. Escorts scrambled and merchant decks braced for the shadow of bombers to pass overhead. The aircraft's presence alone could change a convoy's course, force fuel consumption upward, and throw plans into disarray. In the pilot's logbooks, sorties read like ledger entries of effectiveness. They measured tonnage and time, not loss. The Atlantic became measurable and manageable to those who could see from above. The sense of mastery fed itself. Confidence bred more daring. Joe 88s brought a different talent to the theatre. Speed, versatility, and a crew that could switch roles from bomber to intruder in the sweep of a mission. At dawn and dusk, their silhouettes cut into the gold of low cloud, and their arrival made merchant men search the horizon for shadow. They attacked with aggressive torpedo runs and precise glancing blows that could cripple an escort's ability to defend. Flight engineers and navigators calculated fuel and wind with brutal efficiency, their charts a religion of numbers. Within a single patrol, a group could damage multiple ships, break convoy cohesion, and force an escort screen to scatter. The Joe 88A's crews took pride in surgical strikes, their officers praising crews who delivered under difficult sea states. In debriefing rooms, cigarette smoke curled around maps as pilots replayed runs with palpable satisfaction. Stories of daring penetrations hardened into legend. The Luftwaffe's confidence was no accident, it was tactical refinement turned into temperament. Their mastery seemed to confer invincibility. Hinkel, Heisei 111 SES, older and broader, nonetheless offered the backbone of night attacks with heavy bomb loads and stable flight characteristics. Their noses glinted in low starlight and their bomb bays carried purpose like a second heart. Crews learned to make darkness an instrument. Bomb aimers trusted dead reckoning sights and timing cues, believing skill would compensate for any deficiency of sight. Under moonless skies they practiced silent runs, throttling back and letting inertia become ally. At base, pilots drank and laughed, swapping maps and ribbing the greenhorns who still feared the night. That culture of bravado bled into operations. Routine missions became rites of collective proof. The aircrews believed they were the cutting edge of Reich air power, the arm that could reach across oceans and rearrange supply lines. Their reports kept coming in, tonnage claimed, harbors struck, and escorts harassed. Each successful sortie was fuel for their certainty. Each raid confirmed a world view where the sky belonged to those who dared it. Training schools in Germany echoed with the cadence of doctrine and discipline that forged these convictions into habit. Young pilots flew endless hours in simulators and trainers, learning to read instruments with blindfolded precision and to trust plotted fixes when stars hid themselves. Tactical instructors lectured on timing windows, flak avoidance, and target identification, compressing many lessons into a short life of apprenticeship. Crews drilled torpedo runs in the Baltic, their mock attacks followed by real assessments in salty spray and cold wind. The Luftwaffe prized initiative and audacity. The men who showed them were promoted quickly and celebrated loudly. Promotions were not merely ranks, they were validations of a system that functioned brilliantly in the formative years of the war. Veteran captains mentored new men in the art of night navigation, telling stories that sounded like training and sounded like prophecy. The result was an officer corps confident in their capacities and convinced of the night's permanence. That conviction would be tested. Reports from the Atlantic painted a picture of dominance that seeped into propaganda at home, bolstering morale and feeding a narrative of inevitability. Newsreels showed bombs falling into the Black Sea and men saluting in triumph. Images edited for effect and amplified for belief. Soldiers and sailors were fed stories that turned tactical advantage into national myth, and civilians began to equate air superiority with destiny. Pilots returned to bases, to parades, and to medals. Their achievements turned into examples of Aryan ingenuity by a regime hungry for spectacle. Each accolade hardened the idea that technology and training made them untouchable. Yet the stories rarely discussed the variables that actually mattered: radar, intelligence, and allied adaptation, because those variables were either unknown or underestimated. The public face of mastery reinforced risk-taking in the theatre, pride obscured caution, and the skies for a while retained their masters. On the decks of British escorts and the bridges of merchant ships, however, the mood contrasted sharply with the German confidence above. Men huddled under oilskins, peering into night smeared by rain and exhaust, and whispered about the few 200 sightings that had decimated ships before. They learned to measure dread by the reports coming over the wireless: a Condor sighting at dawn, a Ju-88 strike at midnight. Yet, amid fear, practical adaptation took root. Lookouts trained to recognize periscope wakes. Wireless operators patched signals into plotting rooms, and captains adjusted convoy columns to blunt predictable air attacks. They were not passive, they were learning, and learning quickly. Gradually, tactics shifted from mere survival to measured counters. The escorts layered anti-aircraft screens and practiced evasive maneuvers that made simple bombing runs more dangerous. They began to hope for something beyond endurance, for an edge. That hope would arrive via science. Until then, the night was still claimed by those who flew above it. Not all Luftwaffe airmen were arrogant in personality. Many were practical professionals who bore the heavy burden of mortal risk. In the cramped bunks, letters home smelled faintly of oil and tobacco and a longing for normality. Pilots wrote to wives and fiancées about the strange calmness of night patrols and the odd intimacy of flying in formation with men whose faces they barely knew. Their logbooks recorded dates, waypoints, and targets in neat script, a ledger of service that read like a life reviewed in fragments. Some expressed pride, others unease. A few confessed to dreams haunted by flares and exploding ships. Under the veneer of bravado, personal fear and fatigue grew like rust on metal. The human side of mastery was fragile, easily eroded by losses, weather, and the creeping sense that advantage was not absolute. Yet their training and camaraderie kept operations going until new counters arrived. The pilots carried on, believing the next sortie would reaffirm dominion. Tactically, the Luftwaffe's early doctrine had been brilliantly suited to the naval theatre. Quick strikes, reconnaissance that extended the reach of U-boats, and coordinated attacks that preyed on merchant vulnerability. Plans combined electronic navigation with human skill, and coordination with surface units gave the Germans a multiplier for effectiveness. Fleet commanders integrated air reconnaissance into strategic planning, routing submarines toward reported convoy locations and timing attacks to tax escorts. The synergy looked flawless on paper, and often functioned well in execution. But synergy assumes the components remain consistent. It breaks when one piece is altered fundamentally. The introduction of British radar at sea changed that constant into a variable. The coordination that had been a strength became a liability, as detection replaced anonymity. What had been a system of advantage would soon be contested on a new axis. The air's dominion was about to be contested by sight of a different kind. The confidence of the Luftwaffe before radar's dominance reads now as a study in hubris and tactical brilliance combined. A brief era in which engineering and audacity created a dangerous illusion of permanence. They ruled the skies in those months because they had honed skills perfectly matched to the threats they understood. Their pilots executed missions with a professionalism that deserves both recognition and study. Yet their doctrine relied on a night that they assumed could not be seen through by the enemy. That assumption proved fatal. As British science extended into the air and then into the sea, the uncontested space they had dominated shrank rapidly. The arrogance of mastery gave way to the revelation that technological advantage is always temporary unless guarded by adaptability. In the end, the Luftwaffe's early supremacy was not an eternal truth but a stage, brief, intense, and eventually overturned by invention. They ruled the skies until the skies learned to see. The night sky over the North Sea was a cathedral of black silence, broken only by the drone of German engines cutting through cloud. The crews of Heinkel 111 Seth flew confident and composed, their dials glowing amber in the gloom, their eyes blind to everything beyond the dim circle of light. Below them, Britain's coastline slept under blackout, its defences unseen but very much awake. In one control hut near the Suffolk coast, a green radar screen pulsed with faint arcs, each echo marking death's approach. The operator, barely 20, leaned forward as one blip separated from the static and began to move across the scope with deliberate intent. He called out bearings in clipped tones, his voice steady but taut. Moments later, the radio inside a twin-engined Beaufighter crackled with coordinates and altitude. Its crew adjusted throttle and rudder, unseen predators closing in on an unseen quarry. The air around them trembled with the hum of electrical current and the faint scent of ozone from the radar set behind the cockpit. In the darkness, the Beaufighter's pilot smiled. They were hunting ghosts, and tonight the ghosts could finally be caught. The invention of airborne interception radar had transformed uncertainty into weaponry. Within the confined space of the Beaufighter, the radar operator's eyes darted between flickering traces, translating light into pursuit. The pilot trusted those signals completely, adjusting course by degrees invisible to human sense. Each movement was mechanical precision meeting mechanical detection. Technology fused with intuition. At altitude, wind buffeted the aircraft, sleet streaking across the canopy like needles of glass. The target was unaware, flying straight and level toward its mission, its crew believing the English night remained an ally. "Contact, range 1 mile," came the calm voice over intercom, cutting through engine noise like a verdict. Below, the gunner thumbed safety catches and aligned sight lines through total darkness. In that moment, the old logic of air warfare, see then strike, had been rewritten. Now the unseen could kill the unseen. The hunters who once owned the night were about to be hunted by mathematics and magnetism. The German crew of the Heinkel sensed nothing. Their instruments hummed faithfully, fuel gauges steady, propellers a rhythmic heartbeat. In the nose, the bombardier hummed a tune through clenched teeth, his face lit by the soft orange of his altimeter. The radio operator checked frequencies and logged their coordinates with meticulous precision. He had done this hundreds of times before and would have described it as routine. Yet tonight the air itself felt different, thicker, heavier, like a pressure building against the skin of the aircraft. He glanced toward the pilot, who adjusted trim and stared ahead, unaware that death was approaching from below. No searchlights, no tracers, no warning. Only the invisible reach of radar painting their position across a British display miles away. The predators of the previous year were now unwitting silhouettes framed in an unseen crosshair. The Beaufighter's radar operator gave the command with quiet authority. "Target dead ahead, range 400 yards. The pilot tightened his grip on the control column and flicked his gun safety to fire. He could not see the enemy, not even a faint glimmer of reflection in the dark. His entire universe existed within the tiny pulses of light on his screen, and the faith that science had replaced sight. Slowly, the trace moved closer until both signals, hunter and hunted, nearly overlapped. "Visual contact," the gunner whispered as faint exhaust flames appeared ahead, shimmering orange through mist. The pilot steadied his aim, holding the trigger until vibration and recoil consumed the cockpit. Cannon shells streaked invisibly through the void, their impact unseen but unmistakable. The Hunkel's port engine erupted in flame, a sudden torch cutting through night like a wound in shadow. For the first time in history, radar had drawn blood. Inside the German bomber, chaos unfolded in seconds. The pilot's ears filled with the violent percussion of cannon fire and the scream of engines tearing themselves apart. Flames roared through the fuselage, licking along control cables and igniting insulation. The radio operator shouted coordinates. He knew no one would answer. His voice swallowed by static and heat. Smoke burned their lungs, instruments cracked under temperature and stress. The bombardier fought to open the escape hatch, his gloved hands slipping against the lever. Outside, the world was a spinning blur of light and flame and freezing wind. For men who had ruled the night, the betrayal was absolute. The darkness that once concealed now conspired. The pilot tried to pull the nose up, but control surfaces no longer obeyed. As they plunged toward the sea, the final sound in their headsets was a distant echo, the hum of a radar pulse that had found them. On the Beaufighter's return, there was no celebration, only silence and awe. The crew landed under thin moonlight, engines hissing with heat, paint slicked with salt air. Ground crews gathered quietly, their boots crunching over wet tarmac as the pilot climbed down. "Confirmed kill," someone murmured. But the words felt mechanical, detached from the enormity of what had happened. The radar operator removed his headset slowly, eyes hollow with realization. He had guided death through equations and flickers of light. The aircraft itself was a contradiction, brutal weaponry married to invisible waves. In the hangar, senior officers studied the mission log and said little. There was pride, yes, but also unease. The feeling that war had stepped into a realm that human senses could no longer measure. The night, once ruled by courage and eyesight, now belonged to circuits and frequency. News of the interception spread through RAF circles like whispered legend. The first radar kill, they called it, part triumph, part omen. Crews trained furiously, refining procedures and learning the delicate balance between trust in machine and instinct of man. The technology advanced rapidly, each engagement producing data that engineers turned into improvement. Pilots who had once flown by moon and luck now flew by ghostly echoes. Ground controllers, the unseen half of every victory, grew adept at translating radar sweeps into commands that led aircraft into perfect ambushes. It was coordination at a level unseen in warfare before, men and machines weaving together into a pattern of predation. The Luftwaffe's advantage of surprise evaporated with each passing week. Every night, British aircraft climbed into the dark, not as blind defenders but as guided instruments of detection. Radar had given them not eyes, but vision, precise, relentless, unblinking. In occupied Europe, German airmen began to speak in hushed tones about unseen enemies. Reports filtered back from survivors who described tracers erupting from nowhere, ambushes without visual warning, and attackers who seemed to vanish into the void. Briefing rooms filled with questions no officer could answer. How could the British find them at night? How could they strike with such accuracy through cloud and storm? Technical officers theorized about infrared detectors, secret searchlights, or traitorous radio signals. The truth was more extraordinary and more terrifying. They had been defeated by physics. Even seasoned crews began to feel the weight of paranoia. Every static burst in the headset became a potential sign of pursuit. Morale wavered as invulnerability turned to anxiety. The hunters now flew with the knowledge that something out there could see what they could not. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Pilots altered flight paths, descended to lower altitudes, and began erratic maneuvers in futile attempts to confuse detection. The night sky, once their theatre of dominance, had become a labyrinth of fear. British intelligence intercepted messages filled with confusion and dread, reports of ghost fighters and radio shadows. The advantage had shifted irrevocably. Allied crews too understood the magnitude of what radar had achieved. Their survival no longer depended solely on luck or weather. It was now science dictating fate. The invisible had become the decisive factor, reshaping the air war into something colder, more calculated, more inevitable. Beneath the triumph lay unease. What happens when machines begin to see farther than men? War had crossed an invisible line and no one could step back. In the months that followed, the phrase radar kill became part of a new lexicon of warfare: impersonal, exact, and efficient. German bombers that once slipped through clouds unchallenged now found themselves hunted with mathematical precision. The darkness no longer favored courage, it favored circuitry and discipline. Each successful interception confirmed that the rules of combat had changed forever. The men who had once soared confidently above the Atlantic were now trapped in an unseen game whose board they could not read. They were still brave, still skilled, but bravery alone could not counter invention. The night once theirs had been annexed by technology. In command rooms from London to Reykjavik, operators watched the glowing arcs of radar and understood the new age they had summoned. The ocean, the air, and the void itself had begun to echo with detection. For the first time, men died in darkness they could no longer trust. In a small, windowless room beneath the cliffs of southern England, the night hummed with electricity and quiet resolve. Green screens glowed in the half-dark, their circular sweeps illuminating faces young enough to still be called girls, but hardened by the weight of responsibility. The air smelled faintly of warm cables, dust, and tea gone cold. Uniform jackets hung neatly on chair backs, collars open, sleeves rolled for comfort against the endless hours. Fingers hovered over plotting tables, tracing lines that represented lives in the sky above. Outside, bombers prowled the darkness, searching for cities they would never see. Inside, these women, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, fought a war measured in milliseconds and degrees of bearing. Each echo, each faint blip, was a story unfolding beyond the walls. The silence was sacred, broken only by the murmur of coordinates and the rhythmic pulse of machines. They were the watchers, the interpreters of invisible battlefields, and their calm voices would guide death and salvation with equal precision. The WAAF operators worked in shifts that blurred time itself. Dawn and midnight were only words. The radar's sweep dictated their reality. Their eyes adjusted to artificial glow, pupils wide and unblinking as they followed the faint ghostly trails that marked friend or foe. Coffee replaced sleep, routine replaced comfort. Their hands, steady even after 12 hours, slid markers across glass plotting tables as voices from distant posts came through the headsets. Bearing 120, altitude 5,000, one would say, and pencils scratched on maps as lines converged toward intercept. Every movement was synchronized, one woman marking, another calculating, a third relaying to controllers. They learned to speak in clipped syllables, never betraying fear, never hesitating. Precision was their weapon, control their shield. When confusion rose, they smothered it beneath composure. War demanded discipline from everyone, but from these women it demanded perfection in silence. Each operator carried a private ritual against fatigue. Some hummed under their breath. Others whispered silent prayers before each shift. In the stillness between reports, the ticking of the radar console became a metronome of tension. Cigarette smoke drifted in slow ribbons above the screens, marking hours like incense. They were trained not to blink at static, not to assume, not to hope. Hope, they learned early, was for the pilots they guided, not for those who watched. The strain was invisible but constant. Headaches pressed behind eyes, strained to see what eyes could not. They measured victory in disappearance. A vanished blip meant an enemy destroyed, a missed one meant disaster. No medals waited for them at shift's end. Only another long night, another whisper of engines overhead. They fought exhaustion not with rest, but with purpose. The voices they guided were often young, hurried, and filled with static. Pilots calling in for bearings, for altitude corrections, for vectors toward unseen prey. The women's replies came calm, almost maternal, cutting through the noise with a steadiness that grounded panic. Turn starboard 15 degrees, climb to 8,000, target ahead, range decreasing. They never saw the faces behind the voices, but they learned their cadences, who was confident, who was nervous, who was near breaking. Over time they could sense outcome in tone alone. When a transmission cut abruptly, silence filled the room like an open wound. Yet there was no time for mourning. Another voice, another interception demanded focus. The battle continued even as ghosts accumulated in their memories. Calm under pressure became instinct. To hesitate even for a heartbeat meant someone's death. Their training had been rigorous, stripped of sentiment and steeped in precision. Instructors had drilled them on mathematics, radio operation, and the art of interpreting faint signals amid chaos. They learned how temperature affected radar returns, how terrain could trick the eye, how to judge speed by intuition. Every mistake in practice was treated as a hypothetical death in reality. It was not cruelty, it was preparation. The war left no room for approximation. The WAAF recruits had been schoolteachers, typists, daughters of shopkeepers. Now they commanded the sky's invisible front. To the outside world they were auxiliaries. To the men who lived or died by their directions, they were lifelines. Behind each confident Roger, intercepting now, stood a woman who had turned fear into calculation. They were soldiers without rank, warriors without weapons. In moments of crisis, their composure was tested beyond limits. One night, a sudden swarm of Luftwaffe bombers crossed the channel undetected by ground observers. Alarms blared through corridors, and in the radar room, operators leaned closer to their screens as faint signals emerged. Sweat gathered at the base of necks, unnoticed and irrelevant. Controllers barked commands. Plotters' hands moved faster than thought. Multiple contacts confirmed, someone announced, voice calm though heart pounding. They began directing fighters into intercept, stacking squadrons in altitude like invisible sentinels. Every vector issued could mean interception or collision. Outside, the night was chaos. Inside, it was orchestration. And when, hours later, the bombers turned back across the sea, it was these women who had drawn the lines of resistance. They never left the room, but they shaped the sky. Even in the lulls, tension never fully eased. The operators lived in a rhythm of adrenaline and aftermath, where quiet felt almost hostile. Between missions they drank tea gone bitter from long standing and joked softly to release the pressure that could not be spoken. Friendships were forged in low whispers and shared glances, bonds that transcended class and background. When one operator's brother was reported missing in action, the entire watch volunteered to cover her shifts. Empathy did not weaken them, it defined them. Theirs was a courage that did not roar but endured, steady as the sweep of radar across the screen. Every rotation meant readiness renewed, and as dawn light crept into the room, they watched the sky's pale rebirth, knowing they had guarded it through the dark. To the pilots, these women existed as disembodied voices, confident presences that turned terror into order. Many never met the operators who saved their lives, yet wrote letters to command asking to thank the girl on the channel. Some of those letters made it back, pinned quietly on bulletin boards or folded in lockers as reminders of unseen gratitude. Others went unanswered, lost amid bureaucracy and war's relentless tide. Still, the women knew the significance of their work, not through praise but through repetition. Each shift was validation, each safe return a silent victory. They joked that their office had the best view in the world, even though they saw none of it. For them, the horizon existed only as radar range, but in the unseen arcs and ghostly echoes, they shaped history in real time. They were invisible, yet indispensable. When historians spoke later of Britain's radar network, names like Watson Watt and Dowding filled the pages. Few mentioned the WAAF women who made those systems function in real battle, yet it was their consistency that made the data meaningful, their discipline that turned theory into defense. The machinery alone could not have saved Britain. It required minds that could interpret chaos with calm precision. Within those dimly lit rooms, they represented a new kind of soldier, analytical, unseen and essential. Their war was one of patience, intellect, and resolve. Even when exhaustion blurred vision and sleep called like mercy, they stayed at their posts. Duty was not glamorous, but it was absolute, and though history might not have recorded every name, their fingerprints marked every victory etched in radar light. Years later, when veterans of the skies met in reunions, they often spoke of the voices, calm, clear, unshakable, voices that guided them home through night and fear. Those voices belonged to the women who had fought without firing a single round, who had turned data into direction and direction into survival. They never wore medals into public parades, yet their precision decided the fate of countless missions. They were warriors of silence, guardians of the unseen front. The radar rooms they once filled have long gone quiet, replaced by museums and memorials that hum faintly with remembered electricity. But the echoes remain, in the steady pulse of radar, in the calm under pressure that modern operators still inherit. Their hands never touched a gun, but they changed the outcome of every battle. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. The Atlantic had once been a killing field for unescorted ships, a boundless plain where submarines hunted unseen. But now a new defense was forming, a shield built from coordination, patience, and technology. Escort carriers, those stubby floating airfields, rolled and pitched beside merchantmen, their decks slick with spray and the smell of fuel. On those short runways, swordfish and martlets waited like caged predators, their propellers idling against the rhythm of the sea. When radar stations reported a contact, the deck crews sprang into motion, signaling through wind and salt as engines roared to life. The aircraft lifted into grey cloud, vanishing into mist that blended horizon and sky into one trembling line. Below, the convoy pushed forward, its columns steady, its escorts forming concentric rings of watchful steel. For the first time, the mid-Atlantic gap, the void where no air cover reached, was closing. Radar had stretched its fingers across the ocean, and the once blind crossing began to see. On carrier bridges, operators traced glowing arcs and sent bearings to destroyers via radio, weaving together men separated by miles of storm. The sea that had swallowed so much hope now began to yield. Technology had reached its long arm into the abyss, and the abyss was beginning to flinch. The hunters of the deep were no longer alone. The consolidated B-24 Liberator became the emblem of this turning tide, its vast wings heavy with endurance, and its underbelly bristling with radar domes that glowed faint green against the Atlantic dusk. Crews flew for 14 hours at a stretch, crammed between fuel tanks, oxygen lines, the dull hum of the ASV radar set that could pick up a periscope at 10 miles. The air inside smelled of sweat and oil, of coffee gone cold, of resolve. On the screens before them, tiny blips appeared and vanished, each a possibility, each a heartbeat of an unseen enemy. When the radar locked on, there was no shouting, only motion. The pilot banked, the navigator confirmed course, and the bomb aimer adjusted the pattern of depth charges. Far below, the ocean erupted into white wounds as explosives rolled from racks, detonating with concussive rhythm. Sometimes oil slicks marked a hit, sometimes nothing remained but boiling water. Yet every attack taught them something new about the tempo of underwater pursuit. Allied air crews learned to stalk submarines the way submarines once stalked them, patiently, methodically, without mercy. The balance of the Atlantic had shifted by degrees, measured in miles of radar range and the courage of men who refused to drift blind. The hunters above now had eyes. Escort carriers did more than launch aircraft. They acted as mobile nerve centers, fusing information from air patrols, convoy lookouts, and shore stations into a living network. In their cramped combat rooms, officers hunched over plotting tables where red and green markers advanced across maps, damp with condensation. Radar sweeps arrived from orbiting aircraft, sonar pings from destroyers below, each plotted into a lattice that tracked the unseen movements of submarines in real time. It was command by geometry, a war fought through bearings and echoes. Overhead, the air roared with propellers, while below, destroyers turned in synchrony like sharks circling unseen prey. Radio operators spoke in clipped monotones, transmitting coordinates, confirming kills, requesting relief. The system was imperfect but relentless. The very act of coordination transformed chaos into order. By 1943, convoys moved not as desperate herds but as disciplined formations with distributed sight. The Atlantic gap that had once cost thousands of lives shrank until only the reckless dared enter it. The ocean was becoming a measured, mapped domain. For the first time, the hunter's advantage was crumbling. The technological evolution of the battle was staggering, as if industry itself had chosen sides in the fight for the sea. New magnetron-based radar sets gave clearer, sharper returns, slicing through weather that once hid submarines from human eyes. The British Type 271 radar on escort ships and the American ASV Mach 3 on aircraft became twin miracles of detection. They saw what the ocean tried to hide. The mechanical pulse of transmission met the echo of steel and transformed it into coordinates, a whisper of truth amid noise. Operators learned to distinguish between wave clutter and a periscope, between a whale and a hull, their expertise grown from endless nights of patience. Each successful contact fed another. The process of hunting had become scientific, procedural, almost inevitable. Submarines found no safety even at night, their surfacing betrayed by invisible beams. Pilots joked grimly that the Atlantic itself had learned to talk back. In this new phase of the war, silence had become fatal. The deep no longer concealed, it betrayed. On the U-boats, confidence turned to unease, as aircraft began appearing over convoys long before they could attack. Captains who had once surfaced at dusk to charge batteries now crept upward in fear, scanning skies they could not see. The blackness that had once protected them now felt watched, measured, and mapped. Some crews believed the British had found supernatural means of detection. Others blamed betrayal within the fleet. But the truth was worse. It was invisible, impartial, and unstoppable. Radar turned the hunters into quarry before they even knew the chase had begun. In the tight confines of a control room, with sweat running down steel and gauges trembling, even the sound of the radar detector's crackle filled men with dread. "Airplane above" became the most feared phrase at sea. The old tactics, surface by night, dive by day, no longer held meaning. Technology had rewritten instinct. Beneath the waves, the predators began to realize they were being stalked. The human side of the transformation was no less profound. In convoy escort groups, sailors who had once stared helplessly into fog and moonlight now found a strange new confidence in the machinery around them. The steady hum of radar became the pulse of survival, the unseen rhythm that guided every maneuver. In plotting rooms, the flicker of screens painted a living portrait of safety earned through vigilance. The crews began to sleep lighter, not from fear but from trust in the science that surrounded them. Destroyer captains learned to coordinate like conductors of an orchestra, timing turns and depth charge releases with mathematical precision. Their eyes were not on the horizon anymore, they were on the screens. The relationship between man and machine blurred, forming a bond of dependence and awe. Each successful defense reinforced the idea that technology could protect courage rather than replace it. The Atlantic convoys no longer moved as victims. They were a shield that thought, listened, and struck. Even the most chaotic engagements began to reveal the calm logic behind the defense. When radar detected a submarine near a convoy, aircraft would circle above while destroyers formed a pincer movement from below. Communication between air and sea was now fluent, almost instinctive. Pilots dropped flares that burned with eerie green light, marking the water's surface for the ships to strike. Below-deck sonar pings sang their hollow chorus, rising in frequency as the enemy drew near. The first depth charges went overboard, the sea erupted, and within seconds the air smelled of cordite and oil. It was collaboration on a scale unthinkable 3 years earlier, a symphony of speed, skill, and coordination. Captains who once fought blind now fought like chess masters, anticipating, cornering, finishing. The U-boats that escaped did so battered and terrified. The Atlantic was teaching them a new language, the grammar of detection and the punctuation of destruction. The balance had shifted irrevocably. The success of the integrated radar network transformed morale as much as tactics. Convoy crews began to believe that the ocean was no longer purely hostile, that knowledge itself could be armor. They sang again on night watches, not out of joy but out of defiance, the low rumble of voices blending with the whisper of engines. Radar blips that once meant danger now felt like a warning answered, not a doom approaching. Air crews radioed sighting reports with crisp assurance, and destroyers executed responses within minutes. The machinery of war had grown human in its rhythm, responsive and alive. The sea, though vast, felt suddenly smaller, containable, mapped by invisible lines of vigilance. Each night that passed without a torpedo strike became a small victory. Each safe arrival of food, fuel, and troops carried the weight of all those who had drowned before radar's reign. The invisible had become protector, not predator. Britain and her allies had learned to fight the unseen with the unseen. By mid-1943, statistics told the story that the ocean itself already knew. U-boat sinkings climbed sharply, while Allied shipping losses fell to their lowest since the war's first year. Factories could now deliver faster than submarines could destroy. The hunters were dying faster than they could be replaced. Admiral Donitz, once master of the Atlantic campaign, stared at charts filled with red X's marking boats that never returned. Even his seasoned captains admitted that the balance had shifted irrevocably. The integration of radar, sonar, escort carriers and air cover had made the convoy system nearly impregnable. It was not luck, it was evolution under fire. The Germans called it Die Radar Hölle, the radar hell. It was a perfect description of their new world, no longer hunters but haunted. The sea that had once hidden them now revealed them with ruthless precision. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end in a single decisive victory, but in an accumulation of moments like these, flickers of light on screens, brief contacts on headsets, and the silent hum of machines that turned knowledge into defense. Radar had unified the ocean's chaos into something structured, something survivable. Merchant men sailed under a sky that no longer belonged to death alone. The escorts stood ready, their aerial guardians circling unseen above, their radars sweeping the dark in endless patience. What had begun as desperate improvisation had matured into a doctrine that no submarine could outwit. The North Atlantic, once ruled by stealth, now belonged to coordination. The alliance between science and courage had remade the world's most brutal ocean into a network of vigilance and vengeance. For the first time in years, convoys arrived, whole. The tide of war had turned beneath a canopy of invisible light. For the first time, the hunters of the deep were being hunted from the air. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. By 1942, the once triumphant rhythm of German operations had begun to falter, and the cause was invisible. In laboratories scattered across occupied Europe, The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine gathered their brightest engineers to confront a weapon they could neither see nor understand. The reports were consistent and terrifying. Bombers intercepted in total darkness. U-boats destroyed without warning. Attacks thwarted before they began. Something, somewhere, was watching. In Berlin, officers spoke in hushed tones about Funkmasortung, radio location, a phantom enemy that turned night into a weapon of precision. The men of science were ordered to fight the intangible. In the halls of Telefunken and Lorenz, physicists scribbled formulas that would somehow pierce this British secret. Oscilloscopes flickered. Antennas sprouted like weeds across factory rooftops, each one a fragile hope in the storm of defeat. But the more the Germans searched, the deeper the mystery seemed to burrow into the noise. They had built their war on dominance of the air. Now they were being outflown by mathematics. The first answer to the radar threat came in a small boxy device called Metox, named for the French factory that assembled it under German supervision. It was crude. A wooden frame, a cross of wire, a receiver that hissed like wind through a tunnel. Installed in U-boats, it promised salvation, early warning of the British radar pulses that stalked them at night. Crews listened to the hum through tinny headphones, straining to distinguish radar signals from the static of the sea. At first, it worked. The sudden rise and fall of tone meant danger. The crew dove, and the aircraft's searchlight swept harmlessly above empty waves. Morale lifted. For a few months, the U-boat men believed they had outsmarted the unseen enemy, but success, as always, bred complacency. The Allies had already shifted frequencies, and Metox began hearing ghosts. Its hum became a lullaby of false alarms and silence. The ocean once again closed over their illusions of safety. In occupied France, engineers at Lorenz and GM refined the next evolution. Naxos, a detector sensitive to the new microwave wavelengths of Allied radar. They worked in cold hangars and unheated offices, surrounded by chalkboards filled with sine waves and hope. Outside, the war raged across Russia and Africa, but inside the labs, the enemy was abstract, an equation that refused to yield. The Naxos system could pick up faint radar pulses at longer ranges, giving pilots and U-boats another chance at evasion. Technicians tested it under the flickering bulbs of Brest, wiring fragile antennas along fuselages and periscopes. Early reports sounded promising. Contacts confirmed, aircraft avoided, lives spared. But like all German innovations of the late war, it arrived too late and too unevenly. Field crews lacked training, components failed in salt air, and Allied tactics evolved faster than the manuals. What began as engineering brilliance ended as a desperate race between assembly lines and annihilation. The Germans were not innovating anymore. They were reacting. In Luftwaffe command rooms, frustration boiled over into obsession. Officers who once planned vast air offensives now argued over wavelengths, decibels, and pulse repetition rates. They stared at intercepted British technical manuals as if they contained scripture. The more they learned, the more hopeless the picture became. The British had moved radar beyond detection. It had become integration. Aircraft, ships, and command posts shared information faster than the Germans could jam or deceive it. Countermeasures that might have worked months earlier now failed before they could be deployed. The Luftwaffe tried passive receivers, reflective chaff, even mirrors on aircraft bellies to scatter radar beams. Each failed to restore the old asymmetry. "We are fighting ghosts," one field officer wrote bitterly in his diary, and ghosts, he realized, did not fear counterattack. By 1943, German night fighter crews were haunted by the same invisible predator that terrorized their U-boat comrades. They called it Himmelbett, the canopy of the heavens turned against them. The British had fused radar with ground control and airborne interception, guiding mosquitoes and Beaufighters with unerring accuracy through darkness and cloud. German scientists countered with Liechtenstein radar sets of their own, heavy and unreliable, prone to interference from Allied jamming. Pilots trusted them only half as much as their instincts. Some even switched them off to avoid detection by enemy sensors. The paradox was cruel. To use their own radar was to risk being found by it. The Luftwaffe, once master of technological innovation, was trapped in an electronic hall of mirrors. The radio spectrum had become a battlefield they could not see, and every signal sent was another flare revealing their position. The hunters were being stalked by their own reflection. Meanwhile, in the war factories of Hamburg and Paris, desperate production orders flooded in for countermeasure gear. Men soldered, women assembled, children tested cables that would never reach the front intact. Each new box carried promises of warning advantage, signal immunity, electronic superiority. But radar was not a single machine, it was a doctrine. The Allies refined, miniaturized and networked. The Germans merely built louder answers to quieter questions. The result was chaos. Field units received different systems with incompatible frequencies and uncertain instructions. Captains installed them anyway, clinging to any illusion that science could restore control. And yet, when the Atlantic storms came and the night swallowed them whole, no detector could translate fear. Against mathematics, courage meant little. Against logic, desperation was just noise. In the U-boat pens of Lorient, Admiral Donitz stalked the concrete corridors like a caged predator, demanding results from his engineers. "They see us before we see them," he barked, his voice echoing off walls lined with dripping condensation. His staff presented charts, schematics, prototypes, proof of activity, not success. The Admiral knew the truth even before the numbers confirmed it. Sinkings had plummeted. Losses had become catastrophic. The ocean that once offered concealment had become a mirror reflecting every movement. Crews prayed over the Metox receiver, waiting for its telltale hum, but the silence was worse than the noise. "They are above us already," one radio operator whispered during a patrol. In the claustrophobic dark, even breathing sounded like betrayal. The German war beneath the waves was collapsing. Not through cowardice, but through enlightenment. An enemy had turned understanding itself into a weapon. Inside the laboratories, panic wore the mask of discipline. Scientists spoke in technical jargon to hide the truth they were improvising with blindfolds on. Funding grew scarce. Materials scarcer still. Allied bombers flattened facilities faster than new devices could be tested. Metox was obsolete. Naxos unreliable. Liechtenstein jammed into impotence. Desperate proposals crossed desks daily. Anti-radar paint, underwater decoy transmitters, even radar-reflecting balloons for submarines. Most never left paper. Those that did were rendered useless before deployment by another Allied advance. The pace of innovation had turned Darwinian, and the Germans were no longer the fittest. Every transmission they sent became a breadcrumb in their own destruction. Technology had reversed its loyalty. In the spring of 1944, a captured German officer, questioned by British intelligence, summed up the new reality with weary precision. "You are not fighting us," he said. "You are fighting physics." His words carried no bitterness, only awe. The radar war had ceased to be about gadgets. It was about thought. Logic had overtaken instinct. Calculation had devoured courage. The Luftwaffe's best pilots and engineers found themselves outmaneuvered by equations that never slept. Even the hum of Allied radar became a kind of psychological bombardment, eroding faith faster than bombs destroyed runways. The Germans had once believed technology made them invincible. Now they watched as that same principle turned against them, mirrored in an enemy who understood connection better than domination. For every machine they built, the British built understanding. For every countermeasure, a counter-logic. By the war's final years, the once proud laboratories of the Reich had become tombs of invention, filled with machines that worked too late and ideas that lived only on chalkboards. Engineers still took notes under candlelight, still adjusted dials and soldered circuits, but the sound of progress had become an echo. The Allies no longer fought with visibility or surprise. They fought through patterns, probabilities, and relentless refinement. What Germany called countermeasure was really confession, an admission that they could only react, never dictate. Science, the very engine of their early victories, had turned against them. Every pulse of radar, every flash on a scope, was a silent declaration that the future had already chosen sides. The Atlantic, once ruled by stealth, now belonged to detection. Desperation had worn the mask of genius too long. Every countermeasure failed because the Allies no longer fought in light, they fought in logic. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. Over the cities of Germany, where darkness once promised safety, the sky itself had turned traitor. The steady pulse of British radar now mapped the very heart of the Reich, guiding bombers with mechanical certainty through smoke and night. Each echo painted a target, each return a signal of coming fire. The age of instinctive navigation had ended. Now came the empire of electronics. Pathfinder squadrons flew ahead of the main bomber streams, their aircraft bristling with new devices named H-2S and Oboe, each transforming invisible waves into visible ruin. From the air, cities became lattices of light and reflection. From the ground it felt like judgment. German civilians watched the heavens shimmer with faint pulsing arcs, the ghosts of radar beams they could not touch. In those brief flickers lay both hope and terror, hope that the next signal might pass them by, terror that it would not. Inside the Lancaster bombers, crews worked by the dim glow of instruments, faces lit by the sickly green of cathode screens. The navigator watched radar traces bloom into familiar outlines, rivers, bridges, and industrial sprawl, all rendered in ghostly abstraction. Target confirmed, the Pathfinder reported, his voice steady despite the turbulence. Below, a German night fighter pilot strained against the black canopy, eyes darting across his own radar scope, searching for the thick blur that marked an enemy formation. The Würzburg ground radars relayed data to controllers, shouting vectors into headsets as searchlights stabbed upward through the cloud. Across Europe, two worlds of radio waves collided, one born to seek, the other to warn. The hum of transmitters became the new heartbeat of warfare. No one on either side could see their enemy, only the mathematics of proximity. Between those pulses lay survival. Between them also lay annihilation. Radar had made the British bombers more than aircraft. They were instruments of precision carved from chaos. The H-2 system, its rotating dish beneath the fuselage, scanned the earth below and returned an image of coastline, city, and ruin. For the first time, navigators could see through the night itself, but the Germans learned quickly. Within weeks, their scientists at Telefunken developed receivers that could detect the radar emissions of incoming bombers. They called it Knacksberg, and from its signals they triangulated the approaching streams. For every innovation in the air, there was an answer on the ground. And yet, the answers always came too late. The bombers still came, the cities still burned. The bombers still came, the cities still burned. In the war of detection, speed mattered more than courage. In the glow of radar control rooms deep beneath Berlin, young women plotted the positions of enemy bombers with trembling hands. Above them, Wurzburg radar dishes rotated methodically across the night, sweeping for the next wave. The operator's headphones crackled with updates. Hundreds of contacts, multiple altitudes, endless movement. The controllers could predict the path of the raids but not stop them. Even when night fighters scrambled, they entered a sky already defined by interference. The British had begun to jam the frequencies. Window, they called it. Strips of aluminum foil dropped by the ton from bomber bays, drifting like metallic snow through the searchlight beams. To the radar operators, the screens filled with false echoes, infinite ghosts. The technology that once guided their defense now betrayed them with too much vision. The more they saw, the less they understood. The first use of window came during Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg in July 1943. It was the night radar died. German operators watched in disbelief as their screens dissolved into chaos, a blizzard of reflections impossible to interpret. "They're everywhere," one shouted. "Hundreds, thousands, they're surrounding us." But there were no thousands, only illusion. British bombers flew through the confusion unchallenged, their routes lit by the rising glow of burning districts below. Within minutes, the control system that had guided the Reich's night fighter defense since 1940 collapsed under its own brilliance. Technology had turned on its masters, and the skies above Hamburg became a realm of madness, where metal rain blinded men before the fire ever reached them. In that single night, the German faith in radar cracked like glass under heat. Yet even in defeat, German ingenuity persisted. Engineers at Peenemünde and Rechlin raced to recalibrate their instruments, developing anti-jamming systems and new radar bands beyond the reach of window. They called them Würzburg Riese, giant Würzburgs, massive dishes that could track targets across 70 kilometers of sky. In theory, it was enough to restore control. In practice, the British simply shifted their frequencies again. The duel escalated into a technical arms race, fought not with bullets but with waveforms. Crews on both sides spoke of listening to ghosts of strange tones that seemed alive in the headsets. Beneath every dogfight now hummed a second, quieter war, one fought in oscillations and harmonics, by men who never saw daylight. The engineers had become soldiers, and the soldiers had become instruments. The war had entered its electronic phase. For the Luftwaffe night fighter aces, radar became both weapon and curse. Their aircraft bristled with antennas, cruciform arrays jutting from the nose like metallic thorns. The Liechtenstein radar offered promise, a faint dot for every bomber in range, a heartbeat on a screen, but jamming, reflection, and miscalibration plagued them constantly. Some pilots swore they could hear the enemy's counter-jamming in their headphones, a whispering sound that rose and fell like mocking laughter. Ground controllers urged them onward, vectoring them toward confirmed contacts that vanished on arrival. The more they relied on radar, the more they felt its betrayal. Those who survived often did so by instinct, not electronics. In the end, technology blurred the line between predator and prey, until even the most seasoned hunters were flying blind. As 1944 unfolded, the scale of the air war defied comprehension. Thousands of bombers crossed the Rhine nightly, escorted by radar-guided fighters and shielded by jamming corridors invisible to the eye. The Germans countered with radar-guided flak, new early warning nets, and experimental infrared detectors that promised miracles and delivered none. In the command bunkers of the Reich Air Ministry, officers studied glowing maps covered in flickering lights, each a trace of an attack they could not stop. "The sky," one general muttered, has become an equation. By then, it was no exaggeration. Each frequency shift, each new jamming algorithm, each radar emission had become part of a vast, invisible strategy that only the machines could follow. The war of courage had transformed into a war of computation, and the British were winning. On the ground below, the human toll of the radar war was measured not in frequencies but in flames. Cities from Hamburg to Dresden, Cologne to Kassel, glowed like coals in the night, their destruction directed by signals that travelled faster than sound. Civilians looked skyward in bewilderment, unable to comprehend how bombers could find them through cloud, smoke, and night. To them it seemed supernatural, as if the British had learned to see through God's darkness. German radio stations broadcast reassurances about blind attacks, but everyone knew the truth. The raids were too accurate, the beams too precise. Radar had removed chance from war and replaced it with inevitability. The age of uncertainty was over. The age of precision had begun. When the smoke finally cleared over Europe, both sides realized what they had unleashed. Radar had not only redefined victory, it had rewritten the nature of combat itself. It made men invisible and made visibility lethal. It turned science into both savior and executioner. In British museums today, fragments of those machines sit quietly behind glass, humming no more. Their legacy is one of brilliance and horror in equal measure. The air war was never just fought with bombs, but with ideas, each frequency a duel, each echo a test of intellect over instinct. By war's end, the night skies of Europe had become laboratories of annihilation. The air war became a duel between frequencies, invisible, endless, and merciless. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. In the shadowed valleys and coastal towns of wartime Britain, the pulse of radar was born not in palaces of science, but in factories that never slept. Beneath leaking roofs and blackout curtains, men and women turned equations into instruments that could see through night. The hum of dynamos mixed with the clang of hammers, every sound a beat in the mechanical heart of survival. Across the nation, physics had left the universities and joined the assembly line. Scientists worked beside machinists, their chalkboard sketches transformed into circuits and valves that glowed like captured lightning. The air smelled of solder and oil, heavy with urgency. In places like Malvern, Bordsea, and Dundee, laboratories were evacuated underground, hidden from German bombers that hunted knowledge as much as flesh. There, engineers tested prototypes by candlelight, listening for the steady rhythmic pulse of success. Each working radar unit meant a ship defended, a city warned, a life preserved. Britain had transformed intellect into industry, and industry into armor. Every morning, convoys of trucks rolled from secret depots carrying fragile cathode tubes, amplifiers, and the peculiar precious heart of radar, the cavity magnetron. This tiny cylinder of copper and vacuum changed the course of war more than any bomb. Developed at Birmingham University, it could generate microwaves powerful enough to paint the night sky. The magnetron's hum was the song of the unseen empire. Women in headscarves and men in coveralls assembled them with trembling precision, their hands steady even as Luftwaffe sirens wailed overhead. Few of them knew what the devices were for. They only knew they mattered. In the workshops of the General Electric Company, Ferranti, and EMI, production became ritual: measure, weld, polish, test. A single imperfection could silence 1,000 miles of coverage. To ensure perfection, they worked in silence, broken only by the faint buzz of electricity. Each spark was a whisper from the future. The state had built an invisible army out of glass, copper, and willpower. In the vast assembly halls of Scotland and Wales, workers stood over conveyor lines lit by dim blue lamps. fitting valves and waveguides into casings stamped top secret. The work was monotonous, but never meaningless. Supervisors moved quietly, clipboards in hand, noting efficiency down to the second. On tea breaks, the conversations turned to ration cards and missing husbands, but always returned to the machines. "If this works," one woman said, wiping oil from her fingers, "maybe he comes home." That hope was worth every sleepless night. The rhythm of mass production mirrored the rhythm of radar itself. Steady, recursive, unbroken, from factory to fleet, the pulse was shared, and in that pulse was purpose. Behind every factory line stood the silent architects, the physicists, mathematicians, and engineers, whose theories now bore serial numbers. Robert Watson Watt, the father of radar, traveled from plant to plant like a general inspecting troops. He found science in overalls, genius hidden behind grease. Beside him walked the new generation, Edward Bowen, Bernard Lovell, and Joan Curran, all young, restless, and driven by necessity. Their notebooks became blueprints, their mistakes became innovations. When magnetron prototypes failed, they recalculated overnight and tried again at dawn. "Perfection is secondary to speed," Bowen told his team. They worked until exhaustion became habit. For them, every delay meant another ship lost, another signal missed, another dawn darkened by defeat. They were building the nervous system of a nation, and the nation's pulse had to stay steady. Testing radar equipment was a ritual that bordered on madness. Soldiers climbed icy cliffs in Scotland to mount antennas while waves roared below. Electricians hauled crates of components through mud and rain, connecting wires in freezing wind. The first test transmissions crackled across static-filled air, ghostly echoes rebounding from cliffs and clouds. "Contact," someone would whisper, and the cheer that followed broke the cold. These were victories without medals. Each blip that appeared on the oscilloscope screen was proof that the world could be mapped, that chaos could be measured. Technicians logged every echo, every fault, every mystery. Then they packed the units and sent them to sea, to trawlers, to destroyers, to lonely radar huts perched above coasts. Their invention had left the laboratory. It now belonged to the war. Underground, the work never stopped. In the tunnels beneath Malvern College, evacuated scientists shared space with soldiers, radio operators, and cooks. The sound of footsteps mixed with the hiss of vacuum pumps and the rhythmic tapping of typewriters. War had blurred the line between academia and arsenal. "It's not invention anymore," said one young engineer. "It's survival." On the tables lay magnetrons, pulse generators, and circuit diagrams stained with tea and sweat. Outside, snow fell quietly, muting the distant drone of bombers. Inside, the glow of instruments replaced daylight. The people who labored there were anonymous, nameless contributors to an equation that would outlive them. When the war ended, few of their names would ever be known, but every returning pilot, every saved convoy would owe them unseen gratitude. Even the factories themselves became targets. The Luftwaffe's intelligence soon discovered hints of strange production in towns like Chelmsford and Harlow. To protect the lifeline, Britain moved its radar assembly underground. Mines in Wales became manufacturing floors. Caves in Northern Ireland echoed with the sound of drills and soldering irons. In one cavern, workers joked they were building lightning in the dark. Air raids no longer halted production, they simply rattled the walls while the work continued. Deliveries were made under blackout, escorted by armed trucks through fog and fire. The risk was constant, but so was determination. Radar was not only a device, it was a promise that Britain would never again be blind. Every completed unit was an act of defiance. By 1943, radar production had become a masterpiece of organization. 60,000 people across 200 facilities, each performing one step in a process no single person fully understood. Components moved from factory to field like blood through veins. The Ministry of Aircraft Production coordinated schedules down to the hour. We build the unseen, read a sign above one entrance. The slogan was both truth and morale. Inspectors tested every device to survive salt vibration and the shock of battle. Failures were stripped and rebuilt again and again until they met the impossible standard of war. The supply lines carried not just equipment but belief. From miner to scientist, everyone contributed to the glow that kept the nation alive through the blackout. And in that glow lay the promise of victory. Outside the production lines, Britain's universities became think tanks for refinement and innovation. At Cambridge, mathematicians developed signal filters to distinguish aircraft from weather. At Oxford, engineers worked on faster oscillators for mobile radar sets. Even art students were recruited to camouflage antennas with paint and design. The entire nation had turned into an ecosystem of invention. In those classrooms and cellars, Britain's intellect became industrial muscle. The chalk dust of lecture halls mixed with the iron filings of factories. The process blurred class, gender, and background. All were equal under urgency. One young woman soldering her 1000th joint put it simply, "We build what sees for those who fight." Her words echoed the sentiment of millions. The war was now powered by the invisible. When radar finally covered the Atlantic, the Channel and the skies above Europe, its victory was measured not in explosions but in anticipation, attacks that never arrived, ambushes that failed, lives quietly saved. Every pulse that left an antenna was born from labor, human, mechanical, emotional. The hands that built it were blistered but steady, their creators' names lost in the static of history. Britain had achieved what no nation had before, a seamless union of science and sweat. The miracle of radar was not born of genius alone, but of repetition, of faith in the unseen. Behind every glowing screen stood the calloused hands that made it possible. Behind every radar pulse was not magic, but millions of working hands. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. The victory that radar granted the Allies was measured in convoys saved and submarines sunk, but its accounting ledger contained a column no engineer could eliminate: human loss, intimate and relentless, written in names and dates that no machine could erase. The sea kept its own tally. On rescue decks, exhausted sailors hauled broken airmen from icy water, their clothing shredded, their faces ashen with shock, and the smell of fuel and salt clung to everything like a memory. Survivors coughed and blinked through bright lights, answers tumbling from lips that had nearly stopped believing they would speak again. In hospital wards, surgeons whose hands had once assembled radar parts now stitched flesh and tended burns from cities their devices had helped locate. Nurses moved quietly between beds, their uniforms stained not with solder but with soot and salt, listening to stories of flares, flak, and the sound of entire streets igniting. Each rescue and each hospital bed formed an inconvenient ledger next to the proud reports of interception and success. The engineers who had translated physics into defense began to learn another, harsher lesson. Precision guarantees hits, but it does not choose the target's humanity. There were letters, too, arriving from towns that no longer existed, envelopes that smelled faintly of smoke and grief. Command rooms that once celebrated blips on a screen sometimes sat in stunned hush when told of whole neighborhoods turned to ember. The cost of superiority accumulated quietly per mission and per mile. Victory had its bills, and they were paid in light and in silence. In the rubble of bombed cities, families sifted through ash for photographs, for jewelry, for anything that could anchor a face to a name, and the mindfulness that followed every raid became part of the moral calculus. the nation had to carry. The streets were unrecognizable, flattened into grids of ruin that smelled of heated steel and cooked paper, their stones still warm under bare feet. Children, small and bewildered, picked through twisted metal and called for fathers who no longer answered. Priests read last rites in public squares, their voices thin against the vast black sky, while volunteers built makeshift shelters from tarpaulins and hope. In the rooms that guided those attacks, operators and scientists, many of whom had never set foot in the destroyed neighborhoods, read dispatches and watched footage, and sometimes wept in private. Their triumphs were paper trophies beside photographs of the missing. Their maps had dots for factories and lines for rail yards, and nothing to mark the ache the lines caused. Memoirs later recorded that some technicians could not sleep, haunted by the glow of a screen that had once meant salvation, but had later become the instrument of ruin. Conversations that began with technical parameters ended in confession, and the nation learned to hold two truths at once. Innovation had saved millions, and innovation had delivered unspeakable destruction. The reconciliation was not immediate. It was slow, painful, and necessary. Victory in the dark came at the price of light. The sailors who manned rescue boats told their own stories in blunt, pragmatic tones, the sea takes and sometimes returns. That was the ledger of their lives, and yet even their voices betrayed tenderness when describing pulling men from water that tasted of iron and smoke. They described hands that clutched at rails with the last of their strength, at flannel sleeves, at medals that had once meant a life's purpose, now sodden and useless. Crews worked in the cold spray, hauling survivors who could not speak, who had seen cities melt into flame and heard the fragile music of falling roofs. At sea, the line between savior and witness blurred. Every pickup was a small miracle that required muscle, seamanship, and a readiness to face the wreckage. In the mess after the rescue, men sat silent, sharing soup and glances rather than words, each knowing the photograph they carried would not be taken at ease. Rescue did not erase culpability, but it gave space for care, for tending a world broken by precision. The moral weight never left the boats that carried survivors inland. It only shifted in texture from responsibility to tenderness. Those who saved lives often returned to decks stained with oil and grief. They kept moving because that too was their duty. In the end, their hands were the nearest answer to a question machines could not resolve. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe crews and German civilians experienced the other side of the ledger, their grief an indictment of large-scale choices made far from their homes, and their stories complicated the simple narratives of technological good and evil. Men who had once flown with confident, youthful bravado found themselves returning to fields of ash, their planes draped like funerary shrouds in countryside that had once known only wheat and quiet. Wives opened cupboards and found no bread, and children grew up watching the sky not with wonder but with calculation, an instinctual measure of when to go underground. The German officers who had overseen night defenses recorded their failures with a peculiar mix of professionalism and remorse, recognizing that systems they had trusted had been outmoded by a mind they could not meet. They too had engineers and factory workers, people who soldered and tested and prayed that their efforts would bring safety to their kin. This was a war that rewired communities into factories and factories into archives of sorrow. The moral geometry of the conflict was not a simple arc of right and wrong, but a complicated lattice where technique intersected with fate. Both sides bore consequences that would outlast treaties and ceasefires. In living rooms and interrogation rooms, people compared losses and wondered about responsibility. There were no easy answers, only the sameness of ruin. For radar crews who had spent nights reading blips and translating invisible waves into vector commands, the psychological cost was subtle and corrosive, a long work of attrition on the soul that came not from enemy action, but from the act of being indispensable to destruction. Operators developed rituals to diffuse guilt: a late-night walk, a cigarette, the ritual tapping of a pencil on a table until rhythm turned thought into something less sharp. Some took to writing letters they would never send, apologies folded and tucked away like talismans. Others devoted themselves to tasks that felt lighter, teaching radios to recruits, fixing broken sets in hospitals, explaining systems to civilians who then nodded with an understanding that could not be complete. Those acts steadied them, offered small compensations against the knowledge that their work had redirected iron and fuel into killing. Even so, some of them woke screaming, images of mapped targets overlapping with the faces from newsreels of children pulled from rubble. The mind, once trained to strip human shape from coordinates, struggled when it had to reattach names to numbers. The technicians who once celebrated precision found themselves learning mercy, an emotion that had no formula. Their hands could tune frequency, not conscience. Humanity ultimately refused to be engineered away. The moral debates that followed the war were fractious and furious, attended by men who had never scrubbed a radar valve or pulled someone from the water, but who now argued with legal language about necessity, proportionality, and the ethics of strategic bombing. Philosophers and politicians dissected the choices made in rooms that smelled of ink and smoke, weighing military advantage against civilian cost with a severity that often felt academic to those who had lived the horror directly. Survivors testified in hushed, often halting voices, telling tribunals and committees about the light that had fallen from the sky and the sudden cold that followed. Their testimony reframed victories as complex human events, not clean moral triumphs. For many families, compensation claims and memorials became the first places where public acknowledgement of loss was formalized. For engineers, the hearings were a mirror reflecting a different question than they had ever asked. Did we create tools that should not have been used? The answer did not come in a single verdict. It came in many small apologies, in cleansed records, and in the quiet remaking of doctrine. In classrooms and lecture halls, future generations studied both the necessity of detection and the obligations that come with power. The war retaught a savage lesson about restraint. Ethical discomfort extended deep into Allied ranks as well. Celebrating effectiveness without reflecting on consequence felt hollow in the faces of returning veterans and the families of those who had not returned. Men who had flown Pathfinder runs kept diaries that described not triumph but a peculiar riddle: how to reconcile the technical joy of a mission executed to exacting standards with the sight of a city in flames beneath your wheels. Some wrote poems, some wrote confessions, some never wrote at all. In pubs and reunions, veterans spoke in fragments, trying to find language that would both honor the dead and own the cause of their deaths. Conversations became acts of therapy, the communal rehearsal of memory that tried to avoid either denial or self-accusation. The cultural memory of the conflict required a double vision, one that could hold technological pride and moral sorrow simultaneously, without collapsing into simplistic guilt. That was hard. People tended towards stories that eased conscience. Histories, however, were less forgiving. They kept the ledger open. Yet the same machinery that produced moral dilemmas also saved lives in ways that would be impossible to quantify. Convoys that reached port, air crews guided to safety, towns warned of incoming raids by early detection, and acknowledging this did not eliminate the moral calculus, but complicated it beyond easy judgment. In a coastal control room, an operator might reroute an interceptor away from a civilian target. Because a convoy was at risk, such decisions were made in seconds and judged for decades. The people who made them were acutely aware of trade-offs and rarely spoke of glory. Their language was always pragmatic. When radar detected an approaching formation, controllers calculated likely collateral and adjusted accordingly. sometimes accepting higher risk to military assets to save population centers. Those small split-second mercies saved thousands of lives, unrecorded in headlines but etched into the lives of families spared. British and Allied planners argued that technology's ethical use required constant oversight and humanity. They established review boards and institutional checks designed to weigh necessity against consequence. The mechanisms were imperfect, bureaucratic, and underfunded, yet they marked an attempt to translate remorse into policy. In the end, the moral architecture of war became a matter of institutional practice as much as private conscience. Reconciliation after the war took many shapes. Public memorials, reconciliation meetings between former enemies, and quiet acts of repair performed by individuals who sought to make amends for what no one could fully put right. In seaside towns, veterans met former adversaries in halls that hummed with awkward conversation, and then slowly with stories about families and work. Those gatherings were never simple, but they were necessary. Scientists and engineers attended conferences where they debated the ethics of emerging technologies, determined that knowledge must be bounded by responsibility. Cities rebuilt from ash kept plaques and names, and schoolchildren learned histories that included both the calculus of survival and the human faces of loss. Memorials bore numbers and names, and sometimes small offerings, a ribbon, a photograph, a single toy. The work of remembrance knit together a fractured ethical heritage into something like public memory. The living tried imperfectly to shoulder what machines had wrought. It was an ongoing task of humility and repair. History remembers innovation in dazzling lists of firsts, yet the true cost of those firsts is counted in quiet rooms and small graves, in the way families reorder holidays around absence, and in the way technicians who steered victory carry a map of faces they helped consign to shadow. The calculus of victory proved never to be purely technical. It was moral and social, and threaded through generations that inherited the consequences of decisions made under pressure and fog. Engineers taught their students to measure not only wavelength but also consequence. Pilots taught their sons to honor not just bravery but also restraint. Nations carved into law the lessons of what it means to wield sight when others cannot. The price paid for superiority refracted through thousands of lives, each one a story of survival and sorrow. It is a stubborn human accounting that refuses the comfort of simple legends. Victory in the dark came at the price of light. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the echo that remained was not of artillery or aircraft engines, but of the steady hum of radar transmitters still sweeping empty skies. In the aftermath of war, the technology that had guided destruction now became a guardian of peace. Antennas that once hunted bombers now tracked passenger aircraft. Control rooms that once directed fighters began charting the safe paths of commerce. Yet beneath the relief was a strange unease, the knowledge that this new peace still relied on vigilance born of fear. The war had taught humanity that seeing meant surviving. Across Britain's coastlines, the tall, skeletal radar towers remained standing against the wind, their rotation an unbroken habit even when no enemies came. Engineers returned to their benches, disassembling wartime systems to redesign them for civil aviation and weather forecasting. In the quiet hum of radar stations, science took a breath, recalibrating itself from defense to detection. Peace did not erase the machine. It only changed its watch. The first great transformation came with air traffic control, the invisible choreography of a reborn world. In repurposed bunkers and new towers, men and women stared at circular screens no longer to track death, but to guide life. The same sweeping line that once heralded bombers over London now traced passenger flights bound for Paris, New York, and Cairo. Voices replaced alarms. Coordinates became comfort. Pilots, many of whom had learned to fly in war, spoke to controllers who were often veterans of radar command, their tones calm, precise, professional. It was the same language of war, altitude, heading, contact, now spoken in peacetime. The first radar-controlled flights over the Channel were heralded as miracles of safety, proof that technology could redeem itself through order and care. But the irony lingered like static. The peace of the skies was maintained by the same vigilance that once fueled battle. Humanity had learned to trust its machines, but never to relax. In the laboratories of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, radar engineers became prophets of a new kind of frontier. They traded uniforms for lab coats. Yet their work carried the same tension between wonder and dread. Microwave research evolved into magnetron refinement, and soon into the birth of television, radio astronomy, and communication satellites. The radar dish, once an emblem of defense, became a symbol of exploration. In Cambridge and Jodrell Bank, colossal parabolic antennas rose like monuments to both curiosity and control. Scientists tracked meteors, then missiles, then stars. Every new frequency uncovered another layer of the universe's whisper. Yet the same instruments capable of measuring the distance to the moon were also tasked with detecting the trajectory of nuclear weapons. Progress had inherited paranoia. Every discovery came with a shadow. By the late 1940s, the world had split, not by geography but by signal. In Washington and Moscow, policymakers realized that radar had become the nervous system of modern survival. Its pulse defined not only territory but ideology. The Cold War began not with an explosion but with a broadcast, a race to detect, to warn, to react. Outposts appeared across the Arctic Circle, forming what would become the DU line, the distant early warning system, stretching thousands of miles from Alaska to Greenland. Each radar dome, white and pristine against the ice, stood like a sentinel in perpetual twilight. Inside, crews lived by the rhythm of screens and static, their solitude broken only by the sweep of the beam and the hiss of radio chatter. They were no longer fighting enemies, they were waiting for possibilities. The sound of silence itself became strategic. The new war had no front, only horizon. In Britain, the radar defense network evolved into a national infrastructure, the rotor system. Deep beneath the countryside, old wartime bunkers were refitted with thick doors, generators, and new cathode ray consoles. The threat had changed, but the fear remained. Soviet bombers had replaced the Luftwaffe in the national imagination, and engineers who once designed to repel now designed to anticipate. Radar towers stretched inland, their parabolic dishes turning with relentless precision, searching for signatures in the empty air. Civilians passed them on motorways without ever knowing the quiet tension they carried. The technology had outlived its inventors, becoming part of the landscape itself. To live in the post-war world was to live beneath an invisible canopy of vigilance. The sky no longer slept. It simply rotated. In classrooms across post-war Britain, children learned that radar had saved their parents' generation, and perhaps their own. Textbooks illustrated the waves of detection like ripples on a pond, neat and beautiful. But the veterans who lectured at universities spoke of nights filled with fear, of the exhaustion of men and women who had never seen the daylight shift. Their lessons carried both pride and warning. Technology, one professor told his students, is never innocent. It remembers its purpose. Even when you try to forget, the students listened, surrounded by models of radar towers and transmitters that looked almost decorative in the post-war calm. Outside, jet aircraft thundered through the sky, guided by the descendants of wartime circuits. The nation believed itself safer than ever before. Yet the hum of electricity always suggested another alert. Peace, they realized, was not quiet. It was simply measured. The Cold War radar operators inherited a different kind of terror. They worked in sealed rooms filled with the soft green glow of phosphor screens, watching for signals that could end the world in minutes. Their orders were simple: detect, confirm, respond. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. Training manuals reminded them that false alarms could trigger catastrophe. The old wartime discipline returned, this time abstracted from heroism into mathematics. To watch the radar was to hold a moral weight no one could see. We were ghosts guarding ghosts, one operator recalled. The Cold War was less a battle than a vigil, a generation watching for the mistake that would erase them all. And through it all, radar kept sweeping, never resting, its rhythm echoing the heartbeat of civilization itself. In the 1950s and 60s, radar reached beyond Earth. Its beams, once confined to atmosphere and sea, now mapped the heavens. Radio astronomers used wartime surplus radar dishes to listen for the faint hiss of cosmic radiation. When they did, they discovered the universe was not silent but singing. From those echoes came the first measurements of distant galaxies, the detection of quasars, and later, the tracking of satellites. Humanity had turned its instruments of war into instruments of wonder, but even these discoveries carried strategic value. Space became the new theater of rivalry, and radar became the tether that bound science to security. The same dishes that charted the cosmos also watched for ICBMs. Knowledge had never been so beautiful or so dangerous. By the late 20th century, radar had become mundane, woven into daily life. In airports, in ships, in weather forecasts, in the hum of traffic control towers. Its military origins faded from memory, replaced by convenience and routine. Travelers trusted it implicitly, unaware that every sweep of its beam was a descendant of wartime desperation. Yet those who had built it, now grey-haired and quiet, still felt its weight. They visited museums where old consoles flickered to life for demonstrations, the familiar tone of the sweep pulling them back to nights when the world depended on their vigilance. They smiled, sometimes proudly, sometimes sadly. History had domesticated their invention, but never truly cleansed it. Beneath every radar pulse still lingered the echo of air raids and the hum of cold fear. In peace, as in war, it remained the same machine, watching, waiting, warning. The story of radar after 1945 is not one of endings but of continuance, a technology born in fear, refined in necessity, and matured into the architecture of global order. From storm prediction to space exploration, it became the quiet pulse of modernity, guiding flights, mapping oceans, and listening to the stars. Yet its vigilance still carries the ghost of its birth. The machines hum, the antennas rotate, and somewhere in every control room someone watches the screen, ready to sound the alarm. The technology that once saved Britain became the sentry of the entire planet. Peace is now maintained by the very logic that once waged war. The beam still sweeps across horizon and history alike. It no longer seeks enemies, it seeks assurance. The technology that saved a nation became the sentinel of an uneasy peace. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes. At dawn, the Atlantic lies calm, a mirror of pewter and mist, its waves soft as breath, its horizon stretching beyond memory. On the headlands of old radar stations, the wind hums against the skeletal remains of towers that once pulsed with vigilance. Their metal has faded, but the rhythm lingers, faint as a heartbeat under stone. Somewhere below the surf, wrecks of bombers and submarines rest in patient silence, their rivets rusting into history. Each one carries stories sealed in salt and shadow, fragments of courage, of fear, of endurance. Modern ships pass above them, their radars sweeping in slow arcs, tracing paths across the same haunted water. The screens glow green, serene, unaware of the lives that once fought beneath that signal. Progress hums softly in the background, indifferent yet connected. The war's pulse has become the planet's pulse. Time has softened the sound but not the meaning. Memory, like radar, still travels in waves. On the cliffs of Dover, visitors stand before the ruins of concrete bunkers that once housed radar's first eyes. Grass has grown over the trenches, and gulls wheel where cables once carried the lifeblood of detection. Tourists walk the paths unaware that beneath their feet the ground once trembled with the weight of decision. The air smells of salt and rain, unchanged since the night when the first blip appeared on a British screen and altered the war's direction. Veterans return here in silence, their movements careful, deliberate. Men who remember both the noise and the stillness. They touch the corroded bolts as if to greet old comrades. Each rusted surface seems to hum faintly in the wind, the echo of machines that once divided survival from loss. Their faces hold pride and grief in equal measure. Some bring flowers, others stand empty-handed, yet all share the same look, a gaze toward the horizon that once demanded everything. The land keeps their memory even when the men are gone. The cliffs, too, remember the sound of radar. In naval harbors, memorials rise like masts, granite and steel, inscribed with names that stretch farther than the eye can follow. Each name once beat within the rhythm of radar's pulse, each life a point of light on an invisible map. When ceremonies begin, the veterans' caps tilt in the wind, and the younger officers stand beside them, still learning the silence between notes of remembrance. Trumpets echo across the water, and gulls cry in counterpoint, as if imitating the sonar pings that once guarded these coasts. The crowd remains still, listening to a sound that is not there, the phantom hum of the stations that watched over them. Across the pier, a radar dome turns lazily, white and smooth, its sweep almost imperceptible in the morning haze. Its quiet rotation feels reverent, as if saluting the past with every turn. The ocean glimmers unbothered, endlessly patient. Beneath its surface, lost ships keep their own vigil, waiting for no rescue, keeping no anger. The ceremony ends, but the water never forgets. It keeps what it is given. In museums and archives, the artifacts of the radar war lie preserved under glass. Magnetrons, headsets, flight charts and uniforms faded by time. Schoolchildren peer through displays at the strange shapes of machines that once guarded the world. The guide's voice explains that these devices could see through night, through fog, through fear itself. The children nod, impressed, unaware that each hum once meant a life poised on a decision. For the curators, these objects are not relics but relics with heartbeat, still warm with the memory of human hands. The air smells faintly of dust and old circuits, as if the past is exhaling. One can almost hear the faint click of switches, the pulse of the beam. This, says the guide softly, was the sound of salvation, but also of loss. The veterans who visit sometimes look away before the end of the tour. They remember that progress always hums alongside pain. The past is not silent, it only waits for a listener. Overhead, airliners move in silent grace, their flight paths guided by modern radar networks spanning continents. In their cockpits, digital screens display the same sweeping circles once drawn in green phosphor. The pilots' voices are calm, their precision clinical, the language familiar but softened by peacetime. Radar contact established. Maintain heading. The world now relies on the technology that once saved it, trusting that vigilance will remain benevolent. Airports pulse like living machines, each tower a heartbeat of coordination, each antenna a sentry without fatigue. Yet even here, in the comfort of commercial order, there remains an echo of war's old reflex, the need to watch the unseen. Every passenger who sleeps above the clouds owes their safety to the sleepless legacy of those who once stared into the dark. Peace, after all, is only the well-disciplined cousin of preparedness. The signal still sweeps, the sky still listens. At sea, the night belongs to radar. Merchant ships glide through fog with screens glowing soft green, their captains tracing lines of safety across invisible maps. The hum of machinery replaces prayer, the rhythm of electronics blending with the low hiss of waves. Every echo that returns to the ship's heart is a reassurance. The world is still where it should be. Somewhere out there, another vessel answers the same call, invisible but known. Mariners trust what they cannot see, just as their predecessors once feared it. The sea, immense and secretive, has become legible again, its silence translated into data, its moods charted in light. Yet in the still hours before dawn, even the most modern sailor sometimes feels the ghosts below. The sea's memory is long, and its ledger never closes. Every safe voyage is built on the bones of those who did not return. The radar hums, but the ocean remembers. Time has turned soldiers into storytellers. In retirement homes and veteran halls, the last of the radar generation recounts their nights to audiences who know war only through screens and documentaries. Their voices are slower now, but the detail remains vivid. The flicker of static, the moment the blip appeared, the heartbeat before a decision. They laugh at old mistakes and go quiet at old regrets. Some say they still hear the pulse when they close their eyes, like a watch ticking behind memory. For them, radar is not a machine but a companion, a sound that followed them through youth, through victory, through loss. When they speak, the air feels charged, as though the past itself leans in to listen. Their words ripple outward like echoes in still water. To hear them is to understand that memory itself has a frequency. It fades slowly, but it never dies. On moonlit nights, coastal radars sweep the horizon, their domes glinting pale against the clouds. From a distance they look like sentinels dreaming, eternal, unblinking, patient. Inside, automated systems monitor the sky and sea without the need for human touch. Yet in every rotation lies the ghost of human purpose. Each signal sent into the dark carries the same quiet defiance as it did in 1940. We will not be blind again. Technology endures because memory demands it. The wind rattles the domes, the rain streaks their shells, and still they turn, calm and certain. The sea glows faintly under the moon, each wave crest flashing like a pulse of remembrance. Even the stars above seem to echo that rhythm. The earth watches itself now, but not without feeling. Vigilance has become a kind of gratitude. In London, at memorials dedicated to the silent service and the women of the radar, wreaths rest beneath bronze plaques that shine faintly under the city's lamplight. Crowds gather on anniversaries, their faces lit by candles and phone screens, each flame a small echo of the phosphor glow that once defined an era. The air smells of rain and stone, the sound of traffic muffled by the hush of respect. Bagpipes or bugles begin, and for a moment time folds, the present looking back at its own creation. The speakers talk of innovation, courage, sacrifice. The veterans nod, but their eyes are elsewhere, on the horizon, on the static of memory. They know that remembrance is not about victory, but about vigilance. The radar generation taught the world how to see. Now the world's task is to remember why. The silence that follows the ceremony feels almost holy. It hums faintly like an old signal carried on new wind. The ocean breathes. The sky listens. Between them hums the legacy of men and women who taught humanity to see in darkness and to never again take blindness for safety. The last echoes of their war have become the quiet rhythm of our peace, invisible, constant, protective. Modern radar towers scan the world not for enemies but for balance, for movement, for reassurance that life continues in ordered motion. Their beams pass over old wrecks and living ships alike, touching history with each sweep. The veterans fade, but the vigilance remains. The night, once a predator, is now a partner. The machines still hum, their purpose transformed, but their spirit unchanged. They thought the sky belonged to them, but the sky, like the sea, remembers everything. They thought darkness would protect them, but Britain had given the night new eyes.